Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Time is almost up for Simon. He lies in his hospital bed, waiting with each passing moment the same as the last. He shares a room with other elderly people, waiting for their number to be called. He is dying. The dole room has no form of entertainment. The TV is out of order, and the radio only plays the same music from a local station, music that he does not like. If he hadn't lost the use of his legs, he would have walked out of this place long ago and waited for death in the comfort of his own home. There is no point making friends with any of the people here. Some are gone, their brains given up on them long ago. The ones who are sane could be there one moment and gone the next. Nurses closing the curtains around them before whizzing them away to the morgue. Luckily, Simon's bed is near the window. He can see the tops of the trees from the local park next to the hospital. He wishes to feel the breeze again, being so close to the seaside. Simon has many fond memories of the coastal path that scratched on the cliff's edge, hearing the seagulls call whilst the waves roll onto the hidden beaches below. A nice little town to grow old. Tea or coffee? The nurse asks, taking Simon out of his daze. Coffee, please. The coffee was awful, the bitterness too strong for his liking, but he dared say this to the nurse. She had been kind, only on the job for a week, her whole life ahead of her, while Simon's was coming to its end. Simon has no family to come and visit him. His wife passed on about 7 years ago, and his son had died whilst on a motorbike trip across Europe. He had crashed it somewhere in the Alps when he was traveling down from Switzerland to Italy on the final stretch of his tour. There were no grandchildren, for his son had not married, and Simon had no siblings as well. Simon had lived the last 5 years alone, locked away in his home. Nighttime came to the hospital, and most of the staff had gone home, leaving behind a small night staff member. Everyone in the room had been tucked away to sleep, lights turned off, and the radio set silent. Simon hates the nights in this place. For some reason, it is the most likely time for someone to die. This thought dawns on him. He would hate not to see the rising sun one last time, piercing its rays through the blinds of the window. As Simon drifts off to sleep, a gurgling sound spreads across the room. The elderly lady's bed is opposite his is dying. She is much older than Simon, her skin thinned around her skeleton, with veins poking through her flesh. The machine that is connected to her starts blaring an alarm, and an army of nurses comes racing in, trying to bring the elderly lady some comfort. Simon's view is disrupted by the green curtain being pulled. He is only left with the sounds of death. The gurgling gets louder, as if the Grim Reaper's bony hand is placed around her throat, stopping her from breathing. This goes on for around 2 minutes before the silence re-enters the room. Time of death is 2:02, says the male doctor. She is wheeled out of the room, never to be seen again. Every time this happens, Simon sits in a cold sweat, feeling the breath of death coming closer. The next morning, Simon stares at the empty bed, fresh sheets and clean tables, as if the elderly lady had never been there, ready to receive the next patient who is coming to their mortal end. The day is as usual as they come. Breakfast is usually something small, jam on toast. Then comes the family visits, which Simon passes by sleeping through, feeling jealousy of being left alone. Come evening, there's a bland dinner of supposed meat with some overly boiled vegetables. Before long, the night is here to take another. But tonight, something was not quite right. Simon has a visitor. Simon wakes from his dreary sleep. The corridor lights are still on, but his room is in darkness. Visitor time was finished hours ago, but for some reason, a man is staring at the end of Simon's bed at him. He cannot see the man properly. The room's darkness covers his face, but his presence offers a putrid smell that lingers around Simon's bed. "Who are you?" Simon asks alarmingly. The figure smiles, his needle-like teeth becoming visible, and his eyes an unnatural red. "Your time is almost up," says the figure, his breath smelling like the rotting flesh of a corpse. "Who are you?" Simon repeats. This time, his voice is a little jumpy. The figure walks a little closer, but no sounds of footsteps are heard. Simon presses the emergency button with his finger, calling for aid from the night staff. He taps the button furiously in a desperate plea to get this figure away. The figure's face is within kissing distance of Simon's. The longing stare causes Simon to push deeper into his bed to escape. "Your time is almost up." Two nurses come rushing in to find Simon laying in his bed, curled up into his pillow, crying his eyes out. He tries to speak to the nurses, but his speech comes to nothing. They hush Simon, ensure he is comfortable, and check the readings on the machine. "Get some sleep," says the older nurse, placing her cream-smoothed hand on his. Almost perfectly on time, another victim of death takes place. The elderly gentleman next to me and his family were with him earlier that day. Simon had heard them say their goodbyes. It was as if they knew he had not much time. Simon felt uncomfortable the next day. His nighttime visitor has certainly frightened him, proving that not all is explainable in this world. He ponders his thoughts. Is there an afterlife after this existence? Though Simon did not hear the voice of an angel look down on him like the vicar of his old church used to say, the figure that visited him seemed threatening and vulgar. Simon thought about his life events. If there is a hell, then that is where he will go once his soul leaves its fleshy cell. The monotonous day passes by once again, but the unwelcoming night soon comes. Simon tries his best to stay awake. He thinks that it could have been a nightmare, and if so, he doesn't want another one. Sitting up in his bed, he tries to concentrate on something to keep his mind at bay. He thinks of old songs he had sung when he was younger, books he had read, and old memories of holidays and festive occasions. But then it starts again. His mind wouldn't allow him to think of a single happy memory. Instead, his mind floods with times he wishes to forget. Sad memories, horrible memories. The time he heard the news of the death of his son. The time he watched the final breaths of his beloved wife. The bankruptcy that had almost cost him his life. Simon clenches the bedding, feeling sadness and anger grow within. "Stop it!" Simon shouts. He closes his eyes and places his hands on the top of his head. "Stop it!" Simon smacks his head, trying to make the whirling of unwanted memories finish to leave him in peace. Then, they do stop. A tear forms in his eye as it rolls down his cheek. He wipes his eye with the back of his hands, feeling a sense of relief. But the feeling of dread soon comes when he hears his name being called in a raspy voice. Simon opens his eyes to see the dark figure once again, but this time, he is not alone. Around him are young boys, heads facing the floor. "You have visitors," says the voice of the figure. Almost simultaneously, the boys lift their heads to face Simon. Their skin is of rotting flesh, and their eyes are as black as coal. "Who are they?" Simon whispers. "You don't remember." The voice turns deeper. "These are the boys who fell for your kindness. These are your victims." Simon didn't want to hear any more. He screamed, "Enough, I say!" Simon yells at the top of his voice. The tall figure and the 3 boys walk around the bed. Again, not a footstep heard. All 4 figures stand over Simon as he lies, stuck to his bed. In a split second, all of them show an awful smile. Razor-sharp, pin-like teeth, mouths stretching an unnatural length. The figures dive onto Simon, chomping down on his flesh. He feels the agony as his blood pumps through his veins, pushing at their heads. As if like hungry dogs, their jaws are locked on. The strong stench of death grows, causing Simon to wrinkle and gag. The hospital staff come rushing in to see Simon once again in a cold sweat. His heart rate is through the roof, and his breathing is heavy. Simon screams, waking the other patients who were fast asleep in their beds just a moment ago. Once again, the staff try to calm him down. "Come on, Simon. You need to sleep," says the male doctor. "I don't want to sleep. I don't want to sleep." The next day, Simon could feel the pain in his arms and legs from where the figures had bit down on him. When he searched his skin for any wounds, he could see no redness, no punctures, nothing. The same day passes again, almost as if Simon can predict what will happen next. He grew to like these uninteresting days. At least he's safe. He is alive. The thought of death fears him more now. He believes something horrible is waiting for him on the other side. Around 4 o'clock, it was the family's final hour of visiting time. As he watches the people around the room, a young child wanders away and stands next to Simon. "Hello," says Simon in a confused manner. "Tonight's the night you will die," says the child in an emotional way, with no expression on his face, just a blank stare. His parents came to pull him away. "Sorry," says the mother. The child's emotions return to him. He has forgotten that he had spoken to Simon as he skips around the room and kisses his grandpa. At 5 o'clock, the families are escorted from the room. 6 o'clock, dinner is served. Once again, the same boring hospital food, vegetables, and a bit of meat. From 7 to 9 o'clock, the ones who are sane sit there bored, looking around the room as life goes on. Around 9 is time for bed, the time Simon has been dreading most. The nurse came around with a new drug for him to take. This was unusual, as he'd been on the same prescription for 2 weeks. "These will help you sleep," says the young nurse. Simon puts up a fuss. "I will not be taking these," he shouts, trying to knock the cup from her hand. They eventually do get the sleeping tablets into Simon. They are done with him waking up in the middle of the night screaming. It puts everyone on edge, especially the other patients. Simon can feel the drug take effect in his body almost instantly. He struggles to keep his eyes open as they grow heavier. His head nods uncontrollably. He is scared. He knows that death is coming for him tonight. He looks desperately around the room one last time. No one will help him now. Simon wakes up from his sleep, but not in the hospital bed. He wakes up in a field, somewhere in the heart of what he believes is England. Using his legs has come back as, for the first time in nearly a year, he can stand and walk again. The field has no special features. A small collection of trees sits at the bottom, and a structure sits in the next field over. The sky is a featureless gray. Something draws Simon towards the structure in the next field. Memories start coming, and he feels like he recognizes the place, but it still hasn't returned to him. How am I here? Simon questions himself. Have I died? Upon reaching the structure, he can see that it is used for storage. He opens the door, which is a little heavy but manageable. Inside is a workbench, some tools, and an old tractor that's collecting dust. Nothing special. He feels the splintered wood of the table. Something doesn't feel right or horrible. A feeling of dread. Seconds pass faster. The gray clouds turn a burnt orange as a figure in all black is seen standing in the center of the field. Simon stands in the doorway, stares at the figure for a moment, and recognizes him immediately. The figure has visited him in the hospital. The figure starts to walk towards Simon hastily, causing Simon to jump with fright, frantically closing the door to the shed, hoping it is enough to keep that strange man outside. The few moments of silence are interrupted by the bang of a door, then a second bang, soon followed by a third. "Go away!" screams Simon, who is now curling up on the floor next to the workbench. "You cannot run from your past this time, Simon." The door unlocks itself and swings slightly open, letting in the orange glow. A pale hand comes from behind the door, nails unkept and gaping flesh turning an unhealthy brown. The figure pushes the door open and walks in. Again, not a footstep is heard. "Who are you?" Simon cries. The figure stands over Simon and looks down, no pity on his face. "I am your past." Simon didn't understand what he meant by that. The 3 young boys who visited him in the hospital walked in individually. Once again, their heads are bowed, not looking in Simon's direction. I don't know what you mean," Simon pleads. "Oh, you must remember Simon and these boys." Simon looks at them as their heads lift slowly. He still doesn't know. His mind has faded over the years, and a slight memory loss took effect on him a year ago. He especially struggles with faces. Here stands Arthur Bentley, Chris Pennance, and Tony Gibbon. 3 boys who you have killed, says the raspy voice. The names sounded familiar, names that Simon had not heard since his younger life. Fractions of his memories come back to him. "Oh, no," Simon whispers. "You remember," says the figure with a sinister smile. "That was a long time ago. I'm not that man anymore. I have found Christ. I ask for his forgiveness every day and night." Simon couldn't control himself. He spoke fast, pleading with the figure. The figure laughs. "You have never paid for your crimes. You have gone unnoticed. This part is true. Simon has never faced any charge for murdering these boys. He hid the bodies so well, deep in the fields of unsuspecting farmers, far away from where the crime had taken place. This was also back in the 50s and 60s, when forensic science wasn't how it is today. You tricked these boys, playing as an innocent man. They needed your help. They were lost on the country roads, and they trusted you. The voice grew deeper and deeper. I'm sorry, Simon begs. You took them in your van and you brought them here. You did unspeakable things to their innocence. I know, Simon cries. You got away with it in life. You had plenty of time to pay for your sins, but you cowardly did not. You lived a long life. That's why we took away your wife and your son, so that you can be alone. Simon cries more, crawling to the feet of the figure, begging with all his might to be spared. He is sorry for the crimes he had done. The figure kicks Simon away with his feet. Now, you must pay for your sins in death. The figure turns around and walks toward the door, leaving the three boys standing over Simon. They start to breathe heavily, fingers twisting and turning in a terrifying manner, like dogs waiting for the order to bite. You will now pay. The voice turned to its deepest yet, letting off an almost echo. With that, the doors to the outside close shut, leaving Simon and the three boys in complete darkness. A snarl and a screech can be heard, 3 sets of eyes glowing red, and a hyena's laugh coming from each of the children. Before Simon could have the chance to fend for himself, his legs lost their use once again, making him unable to move. The 3 eyes come closer before he feels the stinging pinch of puncturing teeth in his flesh. One by one, they rip at it, tearing the flesh from his bone. Simon screams in agony. He is repenting to God, but God isn't listening. While the flesh of his arms and legs are gone, they go for his stomach and head. The pain is too much. Though Simon cannot faint, he must feel every bite. When his flesh is gone, he is still alive and conscious. He feels his flesh growing back and again goes through the same torment. Simon's existence in the underworld is to be ripped apart repeatedly, a horrible pain for all eternity. His crime is being paid most brutally. Kevin slammed on the brakes of his rental car. The black ice, something he'd only read about, allowed the 2-door 88 hatchback to slide 30 degrees in the wrong direction. In the passenger seat, his wife Hope put both hands on the dashboard and screamed, a sound that didn't help Kevin get control of the situation. He spun the wheel, overcorrecting. The 30-degree slide became 90 in the blink of an eye. They skidded forward, sideways in the middle of the 2-lane highway, with only the moonlight to illuminate the snow and pine tree outlining the road. The eastbound lane banked to the left, and the car continued to slide straight ahead, toward the shoulder like a marble rolling on an uneven table. "Shit, shit, shit!" Kevin shouted, hoping that expletives would somehow get the car's attention, and it would then behave. It didn't. The back tires left the black ice and the road, and the sound of rubber sliding on gravel echoed all around them. A muffled thud, like a child jumping into a pile of leaves, came with a suddenness as the back end of the hatchback buried itself into a snowbank. Silence and stillness, two things that seemed impossible only a second ago, surrounded them as the world outside stopped spinning. Kevin looked over at Hope. "Are you okay?" The panicked expression on her face began to fade, and it looked as if she was trying to find words. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Hope, are you—"
What are we doing here?
She finally managed. Kevin was taken aback by her question.
Honestly, you have no idea how to drive in the snow. We're San Diego people.
It was true. Kevin had never even driven in the mountains, let alone the mountains in winter. But he thought the payoff for the surprise he was trying to give his wife would be worth the gamble. The surprise was his attempt to rekindle their once vibrant, exciting relationship. The one they had before the wedding, before the mortgage, before kids, PTA meetings, and Saturday morning kids' soccer games. Back when it was just them.
I hate surprises.
Hope said.
Now, I'm not going any further until you tell me why we had to leave the kids with my mother, pack, fly to Portland, a city we've never been to, rent the cheapest car at Avis, just to...
She held her hands up, as if holding aloft a cloud of confusion.
do whatever we're doing.
Kevin sighed, leaned forward, and rested his forehead on the steering wheel, which was much colder than he imagined it would be. I thought it would be romantic.
How is driving me into the middle of nowhere romantic?
It's not nowhere. Kevin sat up. I just wanted... He had planned not to explain this, just show her their destination, and he hoped everything would come flooding back. Remember our first date? He tried to smile, but it felt more like a chilly grin. She scowled at him.
I am not having sex with you in this car.
What? No, I mean the first date where we actually went somewhere.
We went to the movies. You wanted to see The Shining. It had just come out.
You remember, Kevin said.
I remember you were too cheap to buy dinner and fed me popcorn.
Yes, I'm cheap. But remember the movie?
Of course I do. Chills me to even think about it. But I loved it.
You didn't even like horror before that. Now you're a huge fan. She smiled.
True. We even went back to see it 2 more times.
I know. Once we even watched the movie.
I do miss drive-ins.
Hope's cheeks blushed.
I'm still not having sex with you in this car.
Kevin took in her icy blue eyes that he found so amazing. They were cold and warm at the same time, and made him want to tell her things that he could never find the words to say. I just want to go back to when we were like that. Those college kids on a first date. She smiled.
That I can understand. But what does that have to do with Oregon or horror movies?
Not horror movies, The Shining. She shook her head.
Still not following.
The hotel. The actual hotel. Her forehead wrinkled a bit.
The Stanley Hotel? In Colorado?
No, that's the hotel that inspired King to write the book. I couldn't afford that trip.
You are so cheap.
No argument, but remember where Kubrick shot the movie?
A hotel in Yosemite. There was an article in Fangoria.
Kevin sighed. He didn't think it would take this long to explain. Yes, the interior shots were done at Adawando Hotel in Yosemite. They were booked, but the exterior shots were taken at the Timberline Lodge, which is... Kevin pointed a cold finger up the road. About 30 minutes that way.
And that's where we're staying?
Hope said. Kevin detected at least 50% less anger and maybe 10% more excitement in her voice. It wasn't much, but it gave him hope. Yeah, see? Romantic.
Romantic? The Shining?
You do realize the only thing you and I do together anymore is a few times a month. After putting the kids to bed, we save to watch a horror movie. And sometimes it leads to other things, he wanted to add.
It's not always just you and me.
What do you mean?
I think our daughter sneaks out of her room and watches from the top of the stairs. Horror movies can't be good for her development.
We'll find her a good therapist, Kevin said. So what do you say? When we get to the hotel, I will say and do things to you I haven't done in years.
Neither one of us are that flexible anymore,
she said.
And what do you need to say?
Kevin didn't expect the opportunity to present itself like this, but here it was. He looked longingly into her cold and warm eyes and began to say, I love... The glare of oncoming headlights engulfed their car. They had less than a second to brace as a Cadillac struck the front end of their car, which had been sticking out across the narrow road's median. The driver of the car must have tried to turn at the last moment, because it was the tail end of the Cadillac that clipped the front of the rental. Kevin and Hope jolted back as their car went deeper into the snow. Kevin caught sight of the car as it slid by, heading for the opposite side of the road. Moonlight bounced off its rear bumper as it went over the edge of the road, sliding like a toboggan down the slope and out of sight. Kevin turned to Hope.
I'm all right,
she said. They got out, their feet sinking in the snow. Kevin stepped onto the ice-covered asphalt. His boat shoes had little to no traction, but he managed to get to the other side and peered down the slope. He expected to see nothing in the cold darkness, but the moonlight illuminated the thick white layer of snow blanketing the slope. Following the tire tracks, he spied two bright red taillights. The Cadillac had traveled nearly 30 yards down the side of a mountain, its descent only stopping when it collided with a pine tree so large it rose into the night like a Japanese movie monster, blocking out the stars.
Oh shit,
Hope said. We gotta see if we can help.
How? The snow could be 10 feet deep.
I'll walk in the tire tracks. That might help, Kevin said, unsure if it would. He turned to his wife. Stay here. Wave down any car that comes by. Maybe they'll have a car phone. If so, call for help.
Okay, I wish we had a car phone.
Kevin glowered at Hope, knowing she was referring to his inability to pay for any kind of a rental upgrade. She looked back at their rental, which clearly needed several $1,000s worth of repairs.
I'm guessing you didn't get the insurance either.
Honey, there are people down there needing help. Let's stay focused. She turned to him.
I know. Please be careful. You're a cheap bastard, but you're my cheap bastard.
She kissed his cheek, and it surprised him. Not just the gesture, but how cold her lips were. It was then that he noticed her shivering. Maybe go wait in the car. He took his jacket off and handed it to her. She took it.
No, I'll wait here.
Kevin turned toward the slope, and in canvas shoes and no jacket, he stepped into the snow. It took 3 minutes to hike, slide, and fall down to the Cadillac, its engine still idling. Cold and tired, he made his way to the driver's side window. A woman, jet black hair, bloody scalp, slumped forward on the steering wheel. The door was buckled, and the glass window had slid down. White cracks ran across its surface. Hey, hello? No response. Kevin tried the door, but it would not budge. He put his ungloved fingers on top of the window, hoping to push it down further, but the entire thing came apart in his hand. He tossed the glass away. Hey! Reaching in, he gently eased her off the steering wheel and sat her back. Her eyes popped wide open, terrified. It's okay, Kevin said, pulling his hands back into what he thought was an unthreatening gesture. You've had an accident. Can you move? Even as Kevin asked, he knew the answer. The area where her legs were was completely caved in. The engine had been pushed back into the driver's compartment, and the woman's legs had to be not only crushed, but were pinning her to the spot. Kevin couldn't imagine the pain. But the pain didn't seem to bother her, and she wiggled in the seat, trying to free herself as if it were only a piece of her clothing hung up on some protruding objects that tethered her to the spot. Okay, maybe you should just sit still. My wife is going to flag down a car and...
I can't be here,
she said.
I need to go.
Kevin was caught off guard. I don't think either of us has a choice in the matter at the moment.
You don't understand. It was supposed to be a cure.
What cure? You sick? She laughed. Kevin couldn't believe it. Legs crushed, head bleeding, and she actually laughed.
Sick. It's a curse.
Her head rolled back.
And all they did with their theories and science is accelerate the damn thing. It happens so fast now. So unbelievably fast.
Kevin had no idea what she was mumbling about. Okay, so maybe...
It's a virus now. A high-speed virus. There's not even time to...
She looked around, suddenly, as if remembering where she was.
I need to get to my cabin.
She struggled in her seat, leaning into the door. If it were possible, Kevin could imagine the woman tearing her legs off to get out. He stepped close. He had to calm her down. Listen, it's gonna be all right.
I need to go now.
Her voice had suddenly become different. Angrier, yes, but there's something else. Something deeper. His mind raced. He had no idea what to do. Then he noticed a phone. Hey, is that a car phone? Sure it was. Most of the cars he couldn't afford came with car phones nowadays. Cadillacs, BMWs, Porsches. Let's call for help. Can you hand it to me? She ignored him and continued to struggle in the seat, tearing at her seatbelt. He needed to get to the phone. He could go around and try to get it from the other side, but there was a Godzilla-sized pine tree to battle on that side. No, he just needed to reach in and grab it. He leaned in and pushed her back with his forearm and reached for the receiver. Just as his fingers grasped the phone, the woman leaned into him, hard. Off balance, he became momentarily pinned. Her weight enveloped his upper body, and he felt her breath on his neck. Then came a sensation he didn't at first recognize. Her tongue, wet, long, cold, dragged over his jugular, a snake slithering across his marrow, and it shook his soul. He buried a scream and wrenched himself back. Sharp edges scraped his skin as he extricated from the car. He landed in the snow and sat up fast. Jesus, lady, what's your issue? Her head swiveled chaotically, as if on broken joints to face him. Her eyes were yellow, glistening. Her brow bubbled like boiling water, reshaping its surface. But it was her teeth that caught most of his notice. The canines protruded down, becoming ivory daggers. In a voice that wasn't very human, she screamed,
Get away from me!
Horrified, Kevin sunk deeper into the snow. Fuck this. He pushed himself up, then stood. Taking his first step, he glanced back. The woman writhed in the seat like a frenzied animal, shaking the entire vehicle. As the sound of breaking glass echoed in the night, he turned away and headed up. After 10 steps, the impact of the hikes he never went on and the gym membership he didn't have took their toll. He was so out of shape, and going up seemed 10 times more difficult than sliding down. He stopped a moment to catch his breath, leaning forward, feeling like he might puke. He noticed blood in the snow around his shoe. Moonlight glistened crimson on his hand. His palm was bleeding, bad enough to need stitches. He tried to remember if he'd cut himself on the window when he pulled on the glass, but a new sensation stung his neck, like 1,000 needles repeatedly piercing his skin. He reached up to feel around and instantly knew something was wrong. His neck was moist, and he couldn't tell how much, but some of his flesh was missing. That bitch bit me,
Kevin, what happened?
came a call from above. He wasn't sure what she could see from her vantage point, but he tucked his blood-soaked hand behind his back. Nothing! I'm all right.
Is that your blood?
Go back to the car, Kevin shouted. I'll be up in a minute.
Stop telling me what to do. What is happening?
Shouting uphill in the cold at his wife was depleting him of the energy he needed to get back up. So he just waved his hand and started hiking. He could hear her shouting down, but he didn't have the energy to answer. He took in deep, cold breaths, and his lungs began to hurt. Halfway up, he had to stop again and drop to his knees. His heart pounded in his chest, an overworked engine ready to explode, and as he waited for his blood pump to slow, he felt a new sensation. Not new, really, but rather very recent. The stinging of piercing needles he'd felt in his neck had migrated into his head, shoulders, and arms. Tiny jabs into his brain, his muscles, his very bones. It was painful and rejuvenating at the same time. The two sensations came together, intertwining to create something in between, something new.
My God, what is that?
Hope shouted. Kevin saw that she was looking past him, down toward the crashed Cadillac. The sounds of knife blades scraping on metal echoed behind him. He fought the urge to look back. Deep inside him, he already knew what he would see. With new energy, he pushed through the last few yards up the hill. When he finally made it to the road, he collapsed. His legs were shaking, and he felt his skeleton vibrate like a tremor before an earthquake. He should be cold, freezing, but he wasn't. He could feel his skin thicken as if he were growing an insulating coat of his own flesh. Hope rushed toward him, and Kevin felt her approach before he saw her. Something told him that she shouldn't come near, and he held up his hands to keep her away. She clearly misinterpreted his gesture as she grabbed him and attempted to pull him to his feet. He writhed backward, sinking into the snow. Kevin looked into her eyes, still as blue as the day they'd met. A cold, icy blue, but still somehow warm. He wanted to say, "I love you." He hadn't said it in so long. It would be so wonderful to say it one more time, even to hear himself say it. But as he felt a violent upheaval in his mouth, canines spearing downward, pinching his tongue, he knew there was something more important he needed to say. "Get away from me!" She stared at him. He knew she couldn't see him anymore. The look on her face said as much. Her icy blue eyes instantly lost their warmth. They were just cold and fearful. She tried to turn and flee, but fell hard on the black ice. She scrambled to find her footing, but the ice fought back, taking her down. She began to crawl, panic streaking her face. Kevin rose onto his haunches, a position he rarely found himself in. He loved how this felt. There was a howl, long and deep, coming from far down the slope, and he felt as if he should answer, but wasn't sure how. His wife continued to move away, almost up on her feet. Kevin felt the need to follow, pursue like he did when they were young. He moved on all fours. Hope looked back and screamed.
Get away! Get away! Get away!
Kevin lunged at her, seizing her ankle in a clawed hand. For so long, he tried to find the words to say that he wanted to hold her and never let her go. Now, with words replaced by growls, he need only express the sentiment. Just hold on. And he did hold on to her, never letting go, for as long as she lived.
My brother was hanged on a Monday, and 2 days later I followed him. When the trapdoor opened for the short drop, the sharp stop never came. Instead, my soul slithered loose from my body, and I fell into darkness, landing with a crash atop a mountain of junk. Odd battered shoes, gimmicked dice, prosthetic noses, the cheats' cast-offs, the swindler's knickknacks. It all reeked of piss. I pulled the sackcloth off my head. A square moon in a black sky shed some light, but not much. It were actually the light from the trapdoor, a whole world away. I'd have seen the 2 black soles of my feet dangling there if I'd had the wits to look. "Hello!" came a muffled cry from behind me. I tried to stand, but the junk pile shifted under my weight. A set of cupping balls went skittering down the slope. I settled for rolling onto my belly and stared dumbly at the figure making their wobbly way towards me. They wore grayish prison clothes too, though theirs were slashed and daubed with handprints in white and red. They'd cut eye holes into their sackcloth and stitched a smirk into the stiff weave. They raised an arm in greeting. "We saw you fall." Where am I?" "Crook's Landing," they beamed. I could hear the smile in their voice, gesturing at the view from the mountaintop. "You're dead." I followed their hand. A city grew out from the base of the mountain, buildings dipping and then rising again in the middle distance, their shingle roofs overlapping like scales in the dim light. A stiff breeze dragged the stench of the canal behind it, bringing sluggish brown water to mind. And, if I squinted hard, I could make out the millions of scurrying bodies in the streets and back alleys, like a plague of ants. So, this was Crook's Landing. Journey's end for the street grifter, the slick confidence man, and everyone in between. I'd heard about it all my life. How could I not? Growing up above the corner pub. When my brother and I stood at our dad's graveside, his mates clapped our shoulders with tattooed, signet-ringed hands and said, "I'll be in Crook's Landing now, lads." It was an afterlife, a prize, a club. But it weren't real. No more real than heaven. I turned back to the figure on the mountaintop. They'd pulled off their sackcloth masks to give me a chipper wink. Underneath was a boy, hardly older than my brother, who probably got caught up in his local pickpocketing racket. I'd seen kids like him before. He pulled me unsteadily to my feet. "Oh, it's a bit of a shock, right?" "Bit of a shock to be in the afterlife I always took for bunk, and I threw a right fit over it. I can tell you, I thought the moment before death must have sent me round the twist. But it's much easier to say I simply nodded, shook his hand, and said, "Yep." "I'm nosy," he said. "I'm with the Breakneck boys, I am. Saw you fall, we did. Just thought we'd come over and say hello. Better than letting them thrashers get you first. You do look like a breakneck, I reckon." By then, the rest of the gang that called themselves the Breakneck Boys had joined us on the mountaintop. They wore prison clothes too, slashed like nosies, and had decorated their sackcloth masks with sneers and smiles. This mountain was their patch, they told me, and they saw all the newcomers by Scaffold fall out of the sky. They made it their mission to welcome them, recruit them if possible, and at all costs keep them out of the reach of their rival gang, the Thrashers, who lived on the next mountain over. Did you see someone fall 2 days ago?" I asked. The question came so easy, I didn't stop to wonder that I could remember to ask it. My little brother, Charlie. Oh, he'll be scared shitless by all this. Nosy scratched his head in amazement. "The days up there don't mean much to us down here. I hadn't had a new boy in a while anyways. Can't speak for that lot over there, though." By that lot, he meant the Thrashers. Their mountain was smaller, darker, really more of a dune. The gang members gathered along its spine like crows watching us. They'd all seen me fall too. Perhaps they'd seen Charlie. I told Nosy and the boys that I had to ask them, and Nosy agreed to show me the way. "Will you join the Breaknecks when you get back?" said one of the boys, and I had to shake my head. If Charlie hadn't joined the Thrashers, then he must have gone down into the city, and as the older brother, I'd always sworn to look out for him. "Oh," said the boy, crestfallen. Then they perked up. "Can we have your togs? Some of us needs new ones. Got a bit carried away, we did." So, with me dressed in whatever scraps I could get from the mountaintops, we headed over to the Thrashers, skidding down the junk slopes and slashing our forearms on the edges of game card decks. "You must really love your little brother," Nosy said, pinching together the bloodless but no less gruesomely parted flesh near his elbow. "Yeah," I said, winded, as we climbed the next peak. "I really do." And I grasped then for a memory of him, something to make Nosy laugh, and found it was hard, like sinking my hands into tar. A month after my dad had died, I couldn't remember the sound of his voice, or the color of his eyes, and I reckon it must work the same way when you're the one who's dead too. Already I couldn't even remember my mom, and her face had been the last thing I'd seen before they put the sackcloth over my head. I clapped my hands around my skull like I was trying to stop it breaking apart. Nosy flinched. "Oh, sorry. It's just, you must really love him, 'cause most people clean forget as soon as they come here. You all right?" Layer by layer, by texture, by smell, by sound, I dredged up an image of Charlie, a boy of 13 with a buzz cut, hard eyes, and a loud mouth, dirty fingernails, surprisingly delicate tendons at the nape of his neck, the soft hollow between them. I hadn't seen him hanged, didn't like to picture the rope chafing him there, where the toughness fell away, and he looked like a little bird. It'd been me who talked him into working that last scam, and all the others before it. Mom lost the pub when Dad died. She'd lost one home, and we were going to lose another. She didn't tell me as much, but I'd seen it in the single slice of bread and jam she gave Charlie for supper, while we went without. Dad's mates were still hanging around, and I was a tough kid who looked older than I was. Didn't take much to fall in with him, work some short cons. Mom didn't like me doing it, but pretty soon she relied on that money, relied on my building it back up from scratch, rent day after rent day. Charlie started skipping school to help me out, because it was just like Dad always said, real work, not passing some poncy exam, was what put food on the table. So, it was my fault Charlie'd been with me when our sting stung the wrong mark at the poker pits. It was my fault they prosecuted us, the only sons of the late, great Mackenzie Foster, with the full force of the law. It was my fault they slipped a noose around his bird-like neck, and it was my fault that Mom was alone. The Thrashers said the same as the Breakneck boys. That is, time passed differently in Crook's Landing, and 2 days was impossible to peg. But they grudgingly brought their newest recruit forward for inspection. I don't know what I feared more, not finding him, or finding a boy who wouldn't remember me. But none of them were Charlie. So I shook the gang leader's hand and turned cityward. Nosy spat at their feet and hurried after me. Where would he have gone? I asked him as we drew closer to the murky lights. The mountain slide slowly turned to scree. I don't know, he said. Newcomers just slip in where there's space. They might have ended up in the fighting rinks, I suppose. At the startled look on my face, he added, Not to fight, I mean. That's where all the big business happens. Oh, Kenzie Foster holds court there. I bet he does, I said grimly. My old man had come to Crook's Landing and set himself up with a racket then, eh? Old habits, I guess. I didn't like the idea of meeting him again, but it was the most likely place to find Charlie. The dolt idolized our dad, almost as much as he did me. Where are these rinks? Well, you want to head towards the spire there? The one with the crow. No, not to unscaring the man. Blimey, oh! That's an unlucky place to fall. And keep down mountains at 5 o'clock. You'll find it. You can't miss it. Right. Thanks. Nosy nodded and towed the scree like he had something else to say. But when I asked if he wanted to come along, he said, Nah, goes to pick my patch, you know. I'll see you around. I guess. As I crossed the bridge that spanned the canal, I glanced back at him. Dwarfed by the mountain of junk, he looked tiny and lost, like a boat snipped loose of its moorings. He probably never missed his memories, never spared a thought for them or the aimlessness of life in Crook's Landing, until I came along. Even on that bridge, con men went through the motions of find the lady, beckoning me to come and place your bets, while over the railing beggars feigned twisted limbs for coppers, just as they must have done when they were alive. With most of their minds scored away, it was all they knew to do. But there weren't no gullies to perform for down here. There was only the rest of us, and we knew all the tricks. Nosy jammed his sackcloth over his head and went back to his boys. I pressed on towards the spire, cradling my memory of Charlie close, like a cut purse cradles his loot. It was the only thing keeping me, well, keeping me. The streets clogged up closer I got to the fighting rinks. Nosy was right to say you couldn't miss 'em. I was carried along like blood in a vein as the citizens of Crook's Landing surged towards the city's heart to do business, pay levies to my old man probably, or settle rows, and be pumped back out again afterwards, refreshed and ready for trouble. The alleys and side doors around our pub had worked the same way, pinned between a one-eyed hag and a tall, dark-skinned hawker. I had no chance of finding Charlie in the crowd, but Hawker soon noticed my restlessness and stood on tiptoe to scan for my brother's buzz cut. I described for her the twin tendons of his neck, like a swallow's tail. I can't see 'em. Sorry. She shrugged, and then she said enviously, Oh, you must be fresh to remember something like that. I don't remember nothing. This old lady could be my gran for all I know. The one-eyed hag huffed and turned her face away. I just came from the... I realized I didn't know what to call the mountain of junk looming over the city, but she caught on to my vague gesture. By Scaffold, eh? She lowered her voice. How comes you ain't got your togs? A breakneck voice took him. The hawker nodded. Well, that's just as well if you're going to the rinks. Kenzie Foster and his lot don't like what come by Scaffold. They says a good crook don't get caught. She offered me a slim hand to shake, though by now we were crushed so close that the formality made us laugh. I'm Jack, she said. I went to say my name, but nothing came out. I just gripped her hand tighter. Ah, so you don't remember everything. Jag elbowed me the way I often elbowed Charlie. Well, that makes me feel better. While I tried not to panic about forgetting my name and the tiny part of myself that goes with it, was I Bill? Barry? We turned with the crowd into the gawping entryway of what looked like an old meat market. The roof was made of ironwork that would have let in a fresh breeze and some pigeons if Crook's Landing had any, and stalls had been squeezed in along the walls, upper walkways, and across the floor, peddling... What? What do you peddle to people who don't eat or sleep or remember anything except how to wring money out of an unsuspecting mark? Some stalls sold clothes or wigs. Others upcycled the kind of junk I'd crash-landed on. Others ran transparent scams like games at a fair, or hawked dodgy ointments for things like baldness or athlete's foot. They weren't fooling anyone, especially Jag. I felt again the same hollowness I'd felt on the bridge, that we'd all come to Crook's Landing to blindly chase our own tails forever. This petty street stuff was below my dad anyway, so I sliced my way shoulder first through the throng of anonymous bodies toward the center where the noise was loudest. Jag followed me, muttering something about collecting a debt, but I reckon she simply didn't have anywhere else to go. Nosy said Charlie probably hadn't come to the rinks to fight. Most people didn't. but a fight was happening regardless. I could hear the meaty thunk of fist meeting face, or feet squelching in a slurry of ancient shit. A rowdy audience penned the fighters in a circle, shoving them together when they broke apart. Hands were everywhere, waving coins and betting slips like little flags for the bookies to snatch up. I avoided an elbow to the face and climbed up the side of someone's stall, ignoring the sounds of protest from inside. From the striped canopy, I had a better view. The fighters were still fresh, though one had a swollen eye, and the other a limp I guessed must be fake. I watched the men trade blows despite myself, even whooped when my guess proved right, and the limping man shifted his weight to kick the other man in the balls. But the swollen-eyed man just laughed it off and pulled a leather guard out of his trousers. It was a game of trickery. A straight fight hardly passed for entertainment between crooks with nothing better to do. Me and Charlie weren't idle long enough to watch the boxing down in the warehouse district. I promised him I'd sneak us in one day when Dad weren't looking. I never did. He would have loved this. More spectators watched from the walkways above. The mood was quieter up there, like they had bigger fish to fry. I recognized my dad in the middle, but he didn't match the image I had for him in my head. He was smaller in person, slimmer. Death had made him a giant to me. His long brown hair was all plaits and wooden beads, and his two gold front teeth gleamed, just the same way they gleamed in the dark of our room when he came to kiss us goodnight. His breath had smelt of copper, of blood, of palms and dirty coins. Jag followed my gaze with a frown, then shot me a warning look as I hopped to the next stall and the spiral staircase nearby. Two lackeys blocked the way up, but I knew them. "I need to see my dad," I said over the roar of the crowd. "Who?" they snorted when I told them. "Old Kenzie ain't got no brats. Now clear off!" My chest was tight. "But he does! Charlie and me. He died when we were just kids, and you," I pointed to the one on the left, "you died in the shootout with him, right? Your name was... Your name..." But it wouldn't come. Their expressions turned odd. I looked at the right-hand one, who flinched. You used to collect rents from my dad and drink pints of bitter in the pub afterwards. You used to peel all the designs off the back of our coasters, and my mom went mad because we got them printed specially. Charlie liked picking the scabs off of your knuckles to see if you'd react. Oh, come on! There was no dawning recognition, no smile of acknowledgement. But it was like I'd smacked them with words, because they let me through in a daze and took me to my dad. And he brushed me off too, until I told him about Charlie's thin flannel pajamas patterned with ducks, the silver studs he'd bought me when I turned 11 that stained my lobes green, and how the pub carpet always got gummed up with spilled beer and fag ash. I knew then that Charlie couldn't come to him, or he'd remember all this already. Wouldn't he? I trailed off. My dad was still looking at me like a stranger, but he gripped my shoulder and took me with him when he and his racket finally left the rinks. He'd made the harbor his stomping ground, on the far side of Crook's Landing. The journey there felt as long as the walk from our flat to the square where I'd been hanged, and Mom had moved as far away from that life as she could afford. Distance made the mountain of junk look half its height, but space worked strangely here. If I stood on the jetty out to sea, the farthest I could go from the mountain without wetting my heels, and squinted really hard, the miles would fold in on themselves, and suddenly, Nosy and the boys would be right there, waving to me. My square moon, my entry point, still hung in the sky above them. Time hurt my head too, because how can you mark time when the light never changes? When there's no tide, no ticking clocks, no pulse. I explained to Dad that Charlie arrived 2 days before me, but the longer I spent here, the more I understood his confusion. Never mind Charlie. How long had I been here? A month? A moment? Crook's Landing, for all it seemed real, could be a dream playing out in my head in the seconds it was taking my neck to break. "How's your mum?" my dad asked vaguely while eyeing a fake diamond. I don't think he remembered her really. He was just asking because he supposed, as his son, that I must have one, and he should ask. It's not like he remembered her when she was alive, neither. He'd valued his name more. "She's fine," I said. She'd lost her sons and her main source of income within a week, and before that, she'd been left a penniless widow. But yeah, sure, fine. He grunted. "You both followed in my footsteps then." Yeah, they hadn't left us much choice. Charlie's smart though. Should have stayed in school, might even have won a scholarship. He and his cronies got a laugh out of that. "You can't be too smart, neither of you. Snuffing you so young." What happened? Jag had warned me about my dad's dislike of newcomers by Scaffold. I sketched out that final sting in the poker pits for him, the one that got us caught. The look on the guy's face when he realized we duped him. The look on Charlie's face when we realized we had the wrong man. The back doors of the poker pits that opened inexplicably onto kitchens or cold, dry rooms full of hanging pig carcasses. We got lost. We had to fight a few bouncers off. I think Charlie hit one round the head with the chair. Then I made up some stuff about being tackled just as we got clear of the pits and getting shot later at a sleazy clubhouse, and sat quietly while my dad listed everything we'd done wrong. "We'd aimed too fucking high," he said. He flung the fake diamond across the room in disgust, hitting a lackey in the face. His temper hadn't changed then. I used to cover Charlie's ears at night when he really got going, when Charlie grew old enough to be scared. I was scared too, but unlike now, I had a little brother to distract me. "You're shot though, eh?" He cooled and leaned back to look out the window overlooking the harbor. "Same moon as me then." "Same what?" "Same moon, you idiot!" He jabbed a finger towards the sky. "A bullet hole. Yeah, the moon's the way you come in, right?" But he was a shade of a man he'd been, for all his raging. Pity replaced fear pretty quick once I'd hung around long enough to see him go dead-eyed like the rest of Crook's Landing. He only looked lively when someone said his name, but in a way like he didn't quite know why. I lingered on the edge of the world in case Charlie turned up, killing time by watching the dark boats pass by far out to sea, but he didn't. And the longer I waited, the longer this place worked on me, the less I cared. I still remember the details, the duck pajamas, the bread and jam, but they were becoming as random and disconnected from me as the bits of shell and seaweed scattered across the shore. Jag drifted into the harbor eventually. "You didn't tell me Kenzie Foster's your dad." She sat with me at the end of the jetty. "You ain't looking so fresh now. Did you not find him?" "Who?" Her mouth thinned. "Your brother Charlie. Got a neck like a swallow's tail." When I looked blank, she walloped me. "Don't you be going feather-brained on me now, kid. I've been going round asking after him and all. Don't tell me I've been wasting me time." Charlie. Charlie. Charlie, yes! How could I have forgotten? Had he fallen in with some scruffy kids by the canal? Got picked up by a slumlord with wandering hands. Wherever he was dead at 13. I was right. He should have stayed in school. My fault. I liked it. Us foster boys working together. Handling our combined spoils to Mom at the close of each con felt like giving Dad the finger. What if Charlie had stayed in school? He'd be alive. Educated. He'd put a hold down a proper job. He'd have kept our Mom much better than I ever did. Some brother I was. Some son. My square moon still hung over the mountain, with my limp feet dangling halfway between that world and this one. I told Jag how they'd hanged him, They might have shared a noose. Jag listened, watching our own private sky. You know, asking about Charlie's giving me noggin a good prod or something. I remember someone tapping rocks to me ankles and tipping me in the river. I sank, and I sank, and I never hit bottom. Just fell out here. And she didn't sound sad, but happy. Happy to remember something about herself. She sniffed wetly. Water slapped the stilts on the jetty. The harbor had always been silent. I leaned over and watched the water bob and curl against the wood where before it had been all as still as glass. "What's that?" Jag said, pointing out to sea. A boat was sliding towards us. One of the dark ones, from out where the water met sky. Its passenger was cowled, and something in my gut told me this weren't no human soul, but a native creature of Crook's Landing. The prow bumped against the jetty, and the creature turned to face us. Its gaze was cold. "We've all heard you calling for your brother, we did," it said, tapping its chest. "We are touched by your bond." I was still on my hands and knees. I gripped the end of the jetty. Salt stung my palms. Do you know where he is? Is he all right?" "Charlie Foster fell for. Landed himself in Cutthroat Cove." I glanced up at Jag. She gulped. "Cutthroat Cove is to murderers what Crook's Landing is to us. You ain't told me he killed no one." I scrambled up, fists clenched. "He hasn't!" The creature lifted a finger. "He took a man's life before the end of his own. He's already told us how he struck him down. They died shortly after." The frantic escaped from the poker pits. The bouncers. I heard again the dull crack of the chair hitting the guy's head. A sound I'd taken for breaking wood. Had actually been bone. I raked my nails down my face. But listen, he don't deserve to be lumped in with murderers. It was an accident. He's just a kid. Mom had let me feel her belly the first time he kicked. He was strong. With him, it wouldn't be just me and Mom against my dad anymore. I was only 4, but I swore to look out for him, didn't I? Since then, I'd done anything but. So I thumped my chest. I'm responsible for that man's life. I'm the reason Charlie was there. I'm the one who should have known better. You have to let me take his place. You can't, Jack cried. We accept. Seriously? The creature inclined its head. Charlie Foster's young. Cutthroat Cove does not suit him. Yet a life has been taken, and its place must be filled. Come with us now, so that he can be restored to the living world. Living world? I frowned. How is that possible? He was hanged 2 days before I was. He died. Oh, did you hear the bones of his neck snap? The creature asked. Did you watch him cut his body down? I had to admit I hadn't. We'd been kept apart in prison and my cell had no windows. The sight and sound would have driven me mad otherwise. Small mercies. All times existed once in death, it said. And Charlie Foster's neck did not break. His breath has been stopped by a moment. Although that moment has been enough. We'll arrange for a last-minute reprieve on accounts of his age. He will be cut down, and he will soon forget us. You can do that? The creature nodded. How's else you think peoples would know to take the name of this place back with him? As I tried to breathe, well, I don't need to breathe. That's just a habit, I'm dead. Jag gripped my arm. I started remembering myself, and it's you what done that. I don't want to forget again. None of us do. I held her hand. Over on the mountain, the thought of Charlie was spreading through Nosy and his boys like wildfire. In the darkest corner of the fighting rinks, my dad's cronies muttered about a boy who picked at the scabs on their knuckles. In his workshop, Mackenzie Foster recalled the day he hammered a nail through his oldest son's lobes to pierce them. On the bridge spanning the canal, a one-eyed hag whispered about a swallowtail neck. She would soon peer up at the sky, her head tilted to favor one side, and think. Swallows. Birds. Remember those? Crook's Landing was waking up. I don't think you'll have to worry about that ever again, I told Jag firmly, and something about my tone told her it was okay to let me go. I climbed into the boat. As we slid away from the shore, sinking deeper into death, I turned to the creature. How do I know you'll keep your word? Think about the last thing you saw. The last thing I saw. I'm standing on the scaffold, looking down at my bare feet and the huge iron hinges of the trapdoor, trying not to be sick. My toenail was broken. The hangman moves behind me and my head jerks up. Is it happening? I'm not ready. I'll never be ready. The square's packed. There's my dad's mates, the ones who are keeping quiet right now so they don't hang too. There's my teacher, the man who bought the pub after we left, and the baker's wife who slips Mom an extra loaf every once in a while. Before the too large sackcloth goes over my head, I see Mom herself, and I hold her gaze until she starts to cry. She bows her head and kisses the crown of a buzz-cut boy. Her arms cross his chest, pulling him close. His neck is raw, same as his smile.
"Trust me," Cameron said, smiling at his wife, Diana. She looked back at him, no less worried, but he continued to lead her to the basement door. Diana hit the brakes and shook her head, her fingers slipping out of his. Cameron sighed. He looked at his wife with tenderness in his soft features. "If we don't have trust now, how are we supposed to have it later?" he said, smiling again. "This is going to work. I know it in my heart." Diana had tears in her eyes and a pink flush to her pale cheeks. She looked at him until she couldn't, and she looked away. It pained his heart to see her struggling like this, but he understood it. "Your heart is full of beautiful, naive, unconditional love, Cam. It's your brain I worry about. This plan feels completely crazy to me. It's reckless and dangerous, and not worth the possible consequences." Cameron turned her, making her look at him with those beautiful blue eyes. "It is worth it," he told her. "It is absolutely worth it, because it proves that the disease is controllable. I believe love will prevail, and I need you to believe in me." Diana sighed. She turned away once more and walked across the room to the window, staring out at the setting sun and the fire red it turned the sky. "This isn't a game, Cam. It's life or death. We cannot be so lax with this." Cameron still had an endearing look gleaming in his eye when he followed her to where she stood. "Of course, I know that, Diana. I think it will take something this extreme, something this powerful to prove the point. I wouldn't have suggested it if I didn't think it would work." Diana glanced over at him quickly, then returned her eyes to the window. "What about what I think?" Cameron frowned now. He put his calloused hands on her slender arms and rubbed them gently as he leaned over to lightly kiss her shoulder blade. "You know that your opinion matters to me more than anything," he said quietly into her ear. But I also know that you are afraid. It's with good reason. But I don't want that fear to sway you. We've been together for a decade and a half. We've had something special since that day we met in the food court of the mall as teenagers. Something terrible happened, and it has made things complicated for us now. But I believe we can make it through this like we've made it through everything else. I need you to believe it too. When she turned around to face him, those blue eyes glistened with tears. And what if I don't? What if I believe the disease is more powerful than us, than love? What then, Cam? Cam reached up and touched her face, the side of his finger grazing her rosy cheek. He smiled once again. Then I will prove you wrong. You just have to let me. I don't like it. I just don't. I'm so scared. If it goes wrong, it won't. Diana sighed. She took his face in both hands and kissed him, sucking gently on his top lip and then breaking away. Then she put her head down and moved past him. Cameron watched her walk to the kitchen. His finger traced where her kiss had been on his lip. He wondered if maybe he shouldn't follow her. Maybe he should let her come to this on her own. But he feared that she might actually not get there, and this was time sensitive. He could hear her in the other room fixing herself a drink. He heard her shuffling loudly through the ice cubes and then clinking them into a glass. He didn't need to see her to know she was going for the gin. It was always the gin when she was stressed like this. Cameron knew and loved all the little details of her. That was exactly why he knew his plan would work. With that in mind, he walked into the kitchen. She was leaning on the island with her elbows, sipping from a glass, a bottle of gin at her side. Cameron grinned when he saw it. I knew it would be the gin, he said. Just like I knew you would wear the yellow dress to your mother's funeral instead of the predetermined black gown because it was her favorite and that's what mattered to you. I knew you wouldn't get those sandals last year, no matter how much you wanted them, because you didn't actually need them and it felt wrong to buy shoes when you already had plenty. I really did appreciate that you bought those for me. I love them, she said, downing what was in her glass and hurrying to refill it. You also felt guilty, he said, because that's who you are. Remember when I got that new boss at work and he showed me that he was out to get me his first day there? I loved my job and I was so beside myself. What did you do? I told you to transfer, she said, standing up straight. I said I'd move with you to wherever you needed to go because it meant more to see you happy. Cameron nodded. He walked around her and got a wine glass off of the hanging rack. Then he went to select a bottle. He wanted something good for tonight, something special. If things did go bad, he may as well have the good stuff and get to experience it. He chose a crisp Pinot Noir and nodded to himself, satisfied with his selection. That choice is what led us here, Diana. Not just to this town, but to this very moment. Diana wiped her eyes and turned her fearful gaze his way. Do you blame yourself? Cameron was using a corkscrew to open the bottle of wine. I suppose a little I do, he said. It's more than that, though, honey. It was love that led us here, and love that will get us through it. That's my point. Diana still looked nervous. She began to chew on her fingernail. We still have a little time, he told her. Put that down and have a glass of this with me. This wine is older than we are. It's a very expensive bottle. It was actually held onto by my grandfather and passed down to me. I've been saving it. And you want to drink it now in case there's only one of us left come morning? Diana set her glass down on the island with a sigh. No, honey. I want to drink it with you as a toast to the future. You may actually be insane. It doesn't change that you love me. You're right, and that makes me worry about my own sanity. Cameron chuckled. He turned and selected another glass from the rack. Then he poured the wine into both and picked one up, extending it to her. Diana hesitated a moment, but then she took the glass. I really do love you, she said. I wouldn't be so scared if I didn't. Cameron nodded. I know that. Now, How are we supposed to drink stuff this expensive? Don't we spit it back into the glass and not even swallow it? Diana laughed for the first time in hours. You have to swirl it first and make sure to put a pinky up like this when you drink it, she said, demonstrating. You look so sexy when you're being all sophisticated, he said with a wink, and she laughed again, shaking her head. Then he swirled his wine and took a sip. Honestly, maybe it's just me, but it tastes the same as the $30 wine I buy at the grocery store. Diana shook her head. It's you. There's so many layers to it. I taste subtle notes of berry and cocoa, as well as a delicate floral aroma that adds atmosphere to it. It's intricate and complex, yet also simple with a gentle romantic texture to it. Cameron studied his wife for a moment, searching her eyes. Are you being serious? He asked. Diana spit that expensive wine when she burst out laughing. Not at all. I don't have a clue about that stuff, but it sounded good, didn't it? Cameron laughed as well and leaned over to kiss her. Come here, he said, setting his glass down. Diana moved closer, but she kept her glass and gulped at its contents. Cameron held her snugly and nuzzled her neck. She met his embrace with her own, hugging him warmly. They kissed again. I love you, he said. Diana sighed. She laid her head on his shoulder. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay. So we're doing this? If you keep asking, I'm going to think about it more and change my mind, she said with a mischievous smile. Cameron much preferred seeing her like this than seeing her so worried and sad. No matter how things went tonight, this was a small victory in itself. Duly noted, he said, snatching his glass back up and raising it. To love, to the future, and to the cellar. He shouted the last words playfully, downed his wine, and ran towards the basement. All right, slow down, you goober, Diana called out from behind him. Just because I said okay doesn't mean I'm in a rush. Cameron stopped at the basement door and looked over his shoulder at her. Unfortunately, the sky does not feel the same. Time is of the essence, my love. Even faced with death, you're so corny and ridiculous, she said back. Exactly why you love me, Cameron said, opening the basement door. Let's get this party started. He bounded down the steps like an anxious child. He was nervous, and if he was going to be honest with himself, pretty terrified. But he believed that this was going to work. He had to. He heard the steps behind him creaking as Diana made her way down. When they got to the bottom, Cameron pulled a string, and a single dim light bulb above it came aglow. Diana came up and stood beside him. They faced an enormously thick steel door together. They offered no quips or barbs this time. They just faced the door in silence. Their fingers found each other and intertwined. They took big, deep breaths together. Then Cameron nodded and stepped forward, opening the metal door. He stepped through the opening and Diana followed him over the threshold. Then he immediately closed the thick steel door and spun a wheel to lock it in place. Diana let out a quiet, nervous gasp, and he put a comforting hand on her back. It's gonna be okay, he said soothingly. Believe. There's no windows down here. I don't like that. We can't see when it's coming, she said, her voice quivering. We don't have to, Cameron told her reassuringly. We'll feel it. Diana's breathing quickened. She started pacing and fidgeting. What if it doesn't work, Cam? What if it goes wrong? What if this ends violently? Oh, God, I'm so scared right now. Cameron nodded. It's okay to be scared, honey. It's scary. We just have to face those fears and come out the other side. We can do this. Together. I know it. I think you might be a toxic optimist, she said, her head moving as her eyes scanned the thick stone walls of the one-time wine cellar that had been converted into a makeshift prison cell. I don't know how you do it. I think this glass is definitely half empty, and it's going to get worse when we start getting thirsty. You should be scared too, Cam. Why aren't you scared?" Cameron laughed nervously. "Whoever said I wasn't scared? Whoever they are, they're a filthy liar. I'm completely terrified." Diana huffed. She ran her fingers through her hair and tugged at it. "Then, let's go. Let's go back up." "No," Cameron said. "I said I was scared. I didn't say I was having second thoughts. Help me with these." He walked over to 2 thick iron shackles that were hanging from the left wall over a beat-up old mattress. Diana didn't follow him. She resumed chewing on her fingernail. "I should have brought the alcohol down here." "It won't matter soon enough. Come on, Diana. The moon is rising." "I know. This is our last chance to change our minds. To let go of this insane romantic notion of yours." "We're not letting go of anything. Chain me up before it's too late." "I don't want to." "You have to." "Why?" "Because we need to know this thing can be controlled. We need to prove to ourselves that we are stronger than this affliction. This is the only way. Now, come on." Diana sighed, but she walked over. She picked up the heavy chains and clamped the shackles over his wrists, fastening them. Cameron tugged on them to make sure he couldn't get loose. He nodded to her. Then she bent down and did the same with his ankles. "This is so crazy," she said. Cameron jerked his arms and legs around, fighting his chains until he knew for certain that he was secured. "Okay," he said calmly, although his heart was racing. "There's no turning back now. Whatever happens, I love you." "I love you too, you crazy wild man," Diana said. She leaned forward and kissed him while he stood there, suspended by chains. "It won't be long now," Cameron said. "We didn't ask for this. It just happened, and we're lucky. The wolf could have killed, but it only bit, and that old Ford pickup sent it running. We were lucky that day, and we'll be lucky again today. Love will prevail. Let me hear you say it." "Don't make me be corny, Cam. Not right now. Please." "It's not corny. It's the answer. Come on. Look at me right now. I'm shackled to the wall. Just humor me. Say it." Diana huffed. "Love will prevail." "Can you say it like you mean it?" "You were right. I can feel it. The moon. It's happening." "I know. I can feel it too. I love you." "Love will prevail." Cameron smiled. "There you go. That time had a lot more heart. We're gonna make it through this, and then we're gonna go upstairs in the morning, and we're gonna have our coffee, and we're going to know that moving forward, we are more powerful as a couple than this disease is. It will not have control of us. We will have control of it. We will win, Diana. I know it." "Please, just stop talking," she told him, her tears returning. "We came down here a couple, but soon we will only be one person and a monster, a ravenously hungry, violent monster. We have no idea what is going to happen then." "I do." "No, you don't. You hope you do, but you just don't know. You can't know. This thing is wild and unpredictable. It's an animal, a beast. Oh, damn it, this was a terrible idea." "It wasn't. You will see. Just wait." "I know the little details of you, too," she said as she paced around the room before her chained-up husband. Cameron watched her eyes as they roamed over the walls and door, the ceiling and floor. He knew she wanted a contingency plan in case he was wrong. She was looking for a way out, a way to escape and run, and he didn't blame her. "I know you go through toothpaste fast because the first glob you put on washes right off because you always turn the water on full blast by accident. I know you only like chunky peanut butter, unless it's a fluffer nutter sandwich. Then you like creamy. Because no one wants crunchy marshmallows. That's just weird." Diana laughed, sniffled, and wiped at her eyes. I know you have loved all things butterscotch since you were a child, but you never get them because you know that the scent of it alone nauseates me, and I love you so much for that. It really is the little things, isn't it? Cameron said, tears welling in his own eyes now. I still eat it when you're not around, but I brush my teeth with 2 globs of toothpaste before I see you. Diana looked at him. She laughed quietly and he joined her. They both cried and she dropped to her knees. Cameron lunged to reach out for her, but the chains restrained him, pulling him back. I love you, he shouted. Diana didn't answer. Her body went rigid and then relaxed. She spasmed and jerked. Cameron lunged for her again when her bones snapped and she screamed. He knew it was a futile effort, but he couldn't help it. Her head bent back and her jaw snapped and moved, growing before his eyes. Her teeth grew as well, rising and jutting out like so many knives. Her adjusting bones tore through her flesh, shredding it and leaving it on the basement floor. Cameron watched in amazement and horror, and the new flesh showed underneath, covered in glistening silver bristles. Her ears pulled their way up to the top of her head and stretched to points. Diana twisted and jerked before her husband's eyes as her body worked furiously to change shape. Cameron grit his own teeth. She looked like she was in absolute agony and he couldn't stand it. This process was awful and tough to stomach. Looking down to see the floor littered with his wife's beautiful skin, all the blood she lost during the transformation. It was horrible. He hated that she had to go through this. He wished it had been him instead. It broke his heart to see her in pain. When it was all over and the process was finally complete, the only thing left of the woman he loved was those sparkling blue eyes. Cameron stared at the monster that stood before him, a hulking beast of a wolf standing on all fours. He hoped with all his heart that he was right and Diana was still on the inside of that monster. He didn't speak, didn't breathe. The creature had taken his wife's place, didn't seem to notice that he was in the room yet. It had just awakened and was still getting its bearings. The wolf sniffed at the air and looked at the walls. It turned its muscled body towards the door. Cameron couldn't help but gasp when the thing leaped and slammed its giant body into the steel door with a loud bang. Cameron closed his eyes and sighed when he saw that the door held and the thing that was once his wife couldn't get free. When his eyes flicked back open, he saw that the wolf had found him. She was standing a few feet away, staring at him. Cameron could feel her hunger. Streams of steaming drool hung from her lupine lips as she snarled, low and deep. Cameron felt more afraid than he ever had in his life, but he still believed in her. He couldn't breathe or even remember how to try. It felt like there was a huge weight on his chest. His heart was pounding like it didn't care to wait for him and was ready to burst out of his chest to flee the scene. The wolf just stared at him. Was it her? Could it really be? Cameron struggled for a breath, and he felt the wolf was watching with a strange sense of curiosity. I love you, he said, choking out the words. I know you're hungry. So hungry. But you're stronger than that. You can do this. He felt a little bit mad trying to communicate with a wolf, but he had to try. The beast that was Diana stepped forward. Its claws clicked and clacked on the hard stone floor. Cameron swallowed a lump in his throat. His instincts were screaming at him to get free, to get out, to run. But he fought against them. He couldn't give in to those urges. If he treated her like a monster, that was what she would be. He needed to face her, to see her as his wife, as frightening of a concept as that was. He shook and trembled as the wolf drew near. The giant animal sniffed the air again and then continued closer and closer still, those crystal blue eyes staring at him so intensely. It was almost painfully hard for Cameron not to look away. Claws scraped stone. You can do this, Cameron said. It's not the same body, but it's still your body. It belongs to you. You are in control. The hulking beast reached him then. It stretched forward and put its snarling face right in his. Cameron shuddered. He looked at those teeth, and he didn't need anyone to tell him they could tear him to pieces in seconds with little to no effort. She was close enough now that he could feel the heat of her lupine breath moistening his cheeks. He could taste it and sense the way she ached to taste him. "You're in control," he said again, shrinking away from the creature. The wolf just pressed forward, matching him. Its wet nose touched his, and Cameron shook like he was freezing. He looked down at her, at the mere size of her incredible head. He heard the low rumble that came from her. "You're in control," he said again quietly. Tears spilled from Cameron's eyes and ran down his cheeks as he waited for the wolf to rip his throat out, to grab it in those powerful jaws and tear it free. "I love you, Diana," he said to the monster. "No matter what, I'll always love you." The wolf pulled away, leaning its head back. It howled loudly and ferociously, the sound echoing off the chamber walls. Cameron felt in that moment like his wife had been right, that the beast and her were two different beings, like he wasn't going to make it out of there or prove anything to anyone. After the howl, the wolf's big head lowered so that it could stare him in the eye once more over its muzzle of jagged razor teeth. Those bright blue eyes met his, and then the beast pulled away. It turned from him and padded its way across the room, where it turned in a slow circle and laid on the floor against the door. Cameron found his breath and went slack, losing his legs. He hung there in those chains, exhausted but satisfied. "I knew it," he said quietly. "I knew it." Cameron didn't know if she would make it the whole night, if she would be able to resist all the way until the sun rose in the morning. But she had shown enough that she would know either way that the beast could be controlled. He slunk down and knelt on the mattress below him, watching the monster by the door that watched him in turn. "I trust you," he said to her. The wolf answered by eyeing him with a penetrating gaze. It gave a low snarl that made Cameron jump and tug on his restraints. It was going to be a long night, but it was worth it to Cameron, to prove to his wife that she was stronger than her sickness. The night was young, but he believed in her. He believed in love. He believed in tomorrow. He had to. Cameron startled awake, amazed that he had somehow fallen asleep while sharing space with a monster he couldn't run from. "That monster is your wife," he reminded himself. His heart was racing, but when he looked over, the wolf was still curled by the door, and he sighed with relief at the sight. This was his plan, and Diana had aggressively resisted it because she didn't trust herself. And that was why Cameron had known it was so necessary. He could still remember the night she was bitten. It was raining, and she had been trying to make it home from work, driving slowly. She had him on speakerphone because the rain was coming down hard, and he knew visibility would be terrible. Then she saw the body in the road. Cameron had been asking frequent questions, but she answered none of them aside from telling him that she didn't hit anyone. "But I almost ran them over," she said next. "They're just lying face down in the road. I'm going to see if they're alive. Call for help." "I'll call when you're back in the car and I know you're all right." "I can call myself then," Diana said with obvious irritation. Then a car door slammed, and Cameron's heartbeat matched it. He sat with his phone staring at the window and the rain that hit so hard he was convinced it would break. He was willing her to return, to be okay. Then he heard her scream and he gasped, squeezing his phone. Cameron was asking over and over if she was all right, begging her to tell him what was happening. The phone call disconnected. When Diana had made it home that night, Cameron was already outside in the deluge waiting on her with no jacket. He ran towards the headlight beams that cut through the rain. He was about to go looking for her despite not knowing what road she was on or where on that road she was. He couldn't bear to wait any longer. Then the lights sliced through the downpour and he gasped and ran towards them. He didn't realize at the time that Diana was injured. Between the wound, the fear, and the rain, she couldn't see him at all, and she hit him with the car, throwing him to the pavement, where he blacked out. It was Cameron that woke up in the hospital bed with broken ribs, a sprained ankle, and a concussion. One of the broken ribs had punctured a lung. Diana was sitting next to him holding his hand. "I'm so sorry," she told him. Cameron remembered that moment, the confusion, the fear, the headache. He blinked and stared at her, memories of her scream bellowing in his mind. "What happened? What happened to you?" he asked. She had just stared at him for a moment, her eyes lost in her own memories, her face a mask of fear. "Tell me," he pleaded. "You said there was a body. I heard you scream, Diana. I need to know." She looked around the room to make sure there were no prying ears, and then she told him about the wolf. The person in the road was long past dead, and they hadn't been hit by a car. Their throat had been torn away, their blood cascading in a river across the rain-soaked street. Diana heard the growl and looked up to see the animal that had killed the man at her feet. Even though it was on all fours, the size was intimidating. She could see even in the pouring rain that the animal was bigger than she was. Its golden eyes fixed on her, and its lips peeled back in a snarl that showed her the giant jagged teeth lining its enormous jaw. She didn't hesitate. She ran for the car. Diana had closed the door because of the rain, so she had to open it, and that split second was enough for the monster to spring forward and grab the meat of her calf with those teeth. That was the scream Cameron had heard through the phone she had reached for and dropped onto the rain-soaked street, ending the call. She knew if she let the creature drag her away, she was as dead as the man she almost ran over. "I pulled away, let my own leg tear, to escape. Be glad you didn't hear the rest of the screams," she told him. She got in and slammed the door and hit the gas with her bleeding leg. She screamed in agony as she sped home, losing blood. Then she screamed one last time when Cameron appeared before her and she couldn't stop in time. "Let me see your leg," Cameron said. "They fixed it?" "They didn't have to," Diana said with a frown, her mouth quivering like she was going to cry. "It repaired itself. I don't know how. I don't understand anything that happened. I thought I killed you." When the day came that she first turned, their physical wounds had all long gone, and they were just working to get over the emotional trauma of it all. Cameron hadn't seen her turn. He'd actually thought that the wolf had come back for her. It was a crazy thought, but still more rational than what had actually transpired. He looked for her for hours before finding her back at home, naked on the doorstep, covered in blood that wasn't her own. Diana had been suicidal after that. She told him of her experience and how she had no control. She had been there, but it was like she was watching through the keyhole of a door as the wolf that now owned her had torn someone to pieces, eaten them. She vomited as she recalled the tale. Cameron had simply listened and rubbed her back, put her in the bathtub, and helped clean off the blood. He knew after that if she didn't find a way to control the beast, she was going to die. He was going to lose her, and he wasn't ready to. He knew if there was anyone she would fight for, she would resist the monster to keep from killing. It was him. That's when he devised the plan to put himself on a platter for her. She couldn't escape that room, so no one else was in danger, and she would learn how to control the wolf instead of being controlled by it. "It's the only way," he had said. "I can't." Diana wouldn't even look at him. "I almost killed you once. I'm not going to finish the job." "No, you're not. That's the point. You need to see that, to understand your own personal power. You have to trust me." "I don't trust myself." "Exactly, and you need to in order to beat this thing. I know you. I trust you. It's going to work." Diana had snarled like the wolf that hid within her then. Cameron made sure not to jump or even flinch. He couldn't for a single moment show any fear of her. He knew she would run with that, and his plan would be trashed. He just frowned and took a slow, deep breath to calm his nerves. "You weren't there, with me, inside the beast," she told him, the anger still adding an edge to her voice. You don't know what it felt like to be trapped inside and watching the violence. If that had been you on the other end." Cameron had watched the anger leave her then. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close. "It won't be," he said quietly. "You won't let it. But you need that push. Please, don't do it because you believe in me, Diana. Have faith in yourself. I just don't know." He had continued working on it until the next full moon, the night the beast in her would rise again. Tonight. Watching her turn had been agonizing. He could only imagine what it had been like for her to experience. He flinched again, just remembering the sound of her breaking bones. She hadn't killed him, though. At least not outright. Now he looked over at the slowly moving body of the resting wolf curled up by the door with sympathy instead of fear. He wished he could walk over and lay with her, wrap his arms around her furry torso. It was probably for his benefit in this instance that the shackles kept him from doing so. Instead, he let his body fall relaxed, and he allowed himself to doze once more. This time it was the feeling of being watched that made his eyes flick open. The eyes stared directly into his, made his breath catch in his chest. He could hear the sniffing nose nearby and taste the wolf's sour breath. Cameron knew it had to be hungry, maybe even desperate for a kill. It was no ordinary animal that possessed a human. It was something far more sinister. Something demonic. Cameron was trembling. He could feel the tips of the wolf's claws dragging over his chest and stomach, gently for the moment. But for how long? Cameron moved his arms slowly, the chains jingling with his effort. He let his hands find the wolf's soft fur, and he let his fingers sink in. He massaged like he would a pet dog. The beast rumbled, and Cameron fought not to jerk his hands away. He spoke calmly and quietly in as soothing a tone as fear would allow him when he said, "You don't want to hurt me. That's the last thing you want to do. You know me. You love me, Diana. You love me." The wolf jerked out of his grasp then, rising to its full height, almost a foot taller than Diana stood in her human form. It reared back and howled loudly, body rigid with tensed muscles. Then it moved. It was so fast that Cameron wasn't able to restrain the gasp. It was a blur of fur as the beast's arm slashed towards him. The claws on his giant right paw cut through one of the chains and dropped Cameron awkwardly to the mattress. He landed on his shoulders strangely and grimaced in pain, but his eyes remained focused on the thing that had been his wife only hours ago. He spoke her name quietly in repetition like a mantra against the terror that gripped him. The wolf looked down at him and snarled, shaking its head rapidly back and forth like it was trying to tear something only it could see. Then it turned and flew towards the door. The metal creaked and groaned against its weight as they collided. The wolf dove back and charged the door again. It continued to use its own body as a battering ram, howling and snarling wildly as Cameron looked on in horror. He was beginning to wonder if the door would hold. Finally, the beast relaxed and slumped back to the ground. Cameron couldn't help but wonder if it was actually trying to escape, or if that had been Diana forcing the monster to focus its anger somewhere else. He stood so he could look at the watch on his still shackled wrist. It was 4 a.m. There were only a few hours of night left. When the sun rose, Diana would return to him. "We're gonna make it," he thought. "We're gonna make it." There was no way Cameron was going to fall back to sleep, so he leaned against the wall and just watched. He watched his wife doing what he knew she was capable of, regaining control, overpowering the animal. After a few minutes, the wolf got back to its feet and it just walked in slow circles. Then it laid back down. A little while later, it was up again. It paced and walked, claws clacking on the ground. Then it lost it and slammed against the door again, over and over, just like before. Cameron's heart ached as he watched this song and dance. Tears filled his eyes. Diana was trying so hard. She was fighting. He loved her with every ounce of himself. When the wolf relaxed this time, there was blood on the door. Cameron cringed at the sight. He hoped she didn't kill herself trying not to kill him. "No, we're gonna make it," he told himself. Minutes later, she was up again, pacing and snarling. Cameron wanted to tell her it was okay, to talk her down and tell her to be calm, but he knew that she was walking a thin line and just speaking could send her his way in a fury, so he bit his tongue. He grit his teeth as the wolf collided with the door over and over. It was so full of rage and violence. He sighed when she finally relaxed and fell back to the floor. Silently, he pleaded for her assault on the door to be finished. For a while, it seemed that it was. Then she rose again, and this time she skipped the pacing and just went right at the wall of steel blocking her exit. The giant animal launched itself at the door again and again, and the bangs echoed through the room. The metal groaned and the bloodstain spread. Cameron couldn't take it anymore. He screamed, "Stop!" The animal did as he asked, paused, still as can be, on its raised-up haunches, but hunched over, its back curled like a rainbow. Slowly it turned its head towards him and snarled. "Please stop," Cameron pleaded. "Please." The wolf showed its impossible speed again when it spun around and launched itself his direction. Before he even understood what was happening, the other chain was severed and Cameron was collapsing to the mattress below him. He was glad that he made the decision to put it there, or he would have hit the ground hard. Cameron's ears were filled with the wolf's roar of unbridled anger. Then it was on him. Its giant paws pinned his shoulders and it stared down into his eyes. Drool poured from those ferocious teeth onto his face. "It's me," he said to the snarling monster. "It's me, Diana. It's me." But Cameron saw no recognition in those predatory eyes, only hunger. The wolf's tongue emerged and lapped at the air. Its nose moved and jumped as it sniffed at him. Cameron closed his eyes and waited for death. He heard horrible sounds then. There were roars of hunger and pain, sounds like slabs of meat being dropped out of a bucket onto the floor, furious snapping and crunching, scraping nails on stone, moans and a strange slithering like wet snakes wrestling in a lake of blood. Cameron opened his eyes just as a naked Diana fell upon him. He took a sharp breath. Diana was unconscious and obviously injured, but she was alive. He could feel the moving of her chest as she breathed above him. The sun had risen, and they were both alive. Cameron just wrapped his arms around his wife's naked form and he held her, so relieved to feel the contours of her flesh and not animal fur. He kissed her bruised, swollen forehead. "I knew you could do it," he whispered. "I knew you would. I knew it." Diana's only response was a quiet snore, her shoulders moving up and down as she slept soundly upon his chest. Cameron took a deep breath, and his head fell back to the mattress. One hand rubbed his wife's back, and the other ran gently through her hair as he stared up at the ceiling. "I love you."
"Well, Mike, you ready?" I asked.
"Hell yeah. I've been looking forward to this all year,"
Mike replied. "Let's get this car loaded up and we'll head out." The luggage was plentiful. We had to play a game of Tetris to fit it all into my small SUV. There were tents, cast iron cookware sets, and not to mention several cookers full of food and drink for the weekend. "Well, that's all she wrote. Let's hit the road," I said as I placed the last item into the vehicle and closed the hatch. I backed out of the driveway and started our journey to the state park. Upon arrival, I drove the vehicle out onto the field and rolled up as close to the camping area as we could get. The camping area was embedded amongst heavy woodland with various camping lots cleared out.
"Looks like we're the first people here,"
Mike said. "Well, at least we get first pick for our camping spot," I stated. Mike and I proceeded to climb out of the car, walk down the narrow trail to select our camp. We walked for a few minutes when I spotted a nice shady spot encompassed by large trees, an old fire pit, and it was about 10 feet or so from the main trail, just enough for it to feel somewhat secluded. "I think this will be the spot, Mike," I said.
"Works for me."
We walked back to our SUV and started to unload our gear. After several trips back and forth, the small SUV was unloaded, and we began to set up our individual canvas tents. A few hours passed by, and we finally had the camp fully set up. "Hey, Mike, if you want to start on the fire, I'll take the car back to the parking area." "Sounds good, man," Mike replied. I walked back to the car and drove it back out of the park and around the backside of a large metal building just outside the park entrance. The cars are supposed to be out of sight for all reenactment participants to give the illusion of full immersion into the 18th century. With the car now parked, I started my trek back to the campsite on foot. Arriving back at camp, Mike had a decently steady fire going and was in the process of setting up a couple of gridirons on which to cook our dinner.
"Well, what's it gonna be tonight? Chicken legs or pork chops?"
Mike asked. Let's do the chicken," I replied. Mike dug through the cooler and pulled out a pack of 6 chicken legs. The smell of the chicken roasting over the fire was heavenly. As the chicken was cooking, Mike brought out a tankard of his homemade mead. I grabbed my tin cup and held it out, allowing Mike to fill it to the brim. We drank and held conversation until the chicken was done. We feasted on the chicken, and soon enough the dwindling light of dusk was upon us. Mike and I were finishing up our cups of mead as we watched fellow reenactors finish setting up camp. By the time the others had finished setting up, the only light around were from the moon, stars, and the small campfire before us. "Well, I think I'm going to hit the sack," I told Mike.
"Probably a good idea,"
Mike replied. With that being said, I climbed into my tent, shut the flaps, and soon fell asleep. The morning came swiftly, opening my eyes to the shining sun and birdsong. I heard noises just outside of my tent. Slowly sitting up and stretching, I stood up and proceeded to put my Colonial period outfit on. Brown breeches, wool gray stockings, buckled shoes, a white linen shirt, and a traditional tricorn hat. I stepped out of the tent and found Mike already cooking up breakfast consisting of bacon and eggs over the fire. "Morning," I said groggily. "Morning," Mike replied. I noticed that my mouth was particularly dry, so I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler. "That's better," I stated after taking a long drink from the water bottle. I walked over to the fire, grabbing my wooden plate and 2-pronged fork along the way.
"Good timing. Food's ready," Mike said.
"Awesome. I'm starving." I reached down and grabbed 3 strips of bacon and 2 sunny-side-up eggs.
"Well, today is going to be good, but tomorrow will be even better," Mike said.
He was correct. Fridays at this reenactment were called Education Days. It is for the school-age children to come and learn about life in the 18th century. Now, I have to tell you that in the center of this park there's a fort with a period-correct cabin nestled inside. Mike and I were slated with teaching the kids how to properly harvest logs from the woodland as a living exhibit. To start, since it's a state park, we have to select trees that have already fallen to the ground. We cannot cut down fresh trees in order to preserve the natural forest around us. Mike and I ventured into the woodland where we found 3 or 4 trees on the ground which were suitable for log making. With a series of ropes and smaller roller branches, we dragged one tree back to the fort area. I then walked back to camp and retrieved various tools such as draw knives, adzes, axes, wooden mallets, and saws. Soon after returning with the tools, we heard the artillery cannon fire, signaling the opening of the fair. Slowly, groups of children and teachers were swarming each vendor and exhibit. Mike and I started prepping the first log for lumber harvesting. This was not easy work. It could take up to an hour to harvest only a few pieces of lumber from one log. I continued working on the log as Mike explained the history and the tools that I was using. After a couple of hours, it was lunch break. Mike and I paused our work and set up ropes so the children could not access our exhibit for safety reasons. We walked over to one of the many tents that sold period-correct foods. We selected a tent that was selling green beans and turkey legs. While feasting on our lunch, we sat back in a small shady alcove away from the bustling school children. Mike knew considerably more than me about the immediate area.
You know, this area was once inhabited by the Shawnee Native Americans.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I have a fair amount of Native American ancestry in my bloodline.
Well, that's pretty cool, I replied.
My father told me some stories about this area that he stumbled upon while researching our family history. He told me that our people found this land to have mystical properties.
Oh, really? Like what? I asked while taking a large bite out of my turkey leg.
Well, the Kespoko tribe, a sect of the Shawnee, stated they felt the power of the earth no matter where they were in these woodlands. They claimed that their crops always did well and that the water supply never dwindled.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
My father also told me that the Kespoko said that when they drank out of the spring, they felt stronger somehow. Now, the spring has been capped off in recent years, but it still produces fresh water,
Mike added. They must have had a pretty decent life here then.
Well, until the settlers showed up, that is. You see, the settlers had heard of this sacred land and wanted it for themselves to cultivate crops and establish a settlement. So when the settlers came, the natives were pushed out. The few who fought back were either taken prisoner or killed.
Damn, there are a lot of things about history that absolutely disgust me, I replied.
Yeah, well, there's not much we can do about it now.
That's true. The rest of our lunch break, Mike and I sat in silence until we had finished our food. You ready to get back at it?
As ready as I'll ever be.
We walked back over to our exhibit and started harvesting more lumber. The remainder of the day went by fairly quickly. Mike and I took several alternating breaks and taught a few more lessons. Then, before we knew it, the closing of the day was soon upon us. Once the last of the school children were out of the park and the gates were closed, Mike and I started gathering our tools. We headed back to our campsite and put our tools away for the evening. The evenings during the fair consisted of a period-correct dinner. The gathering house was lit with a fire in the hearth and many beeswax candles. We feasted on foods left over from the day. The mead and beer flowed abundantly. Participants of the fair enjoyed this evening time up to 9 p.m., lights out time. After having had consumed copious amounts of beer and mead, Mike and I stumbled our way back to the camp. Upon arrival to camp, I pulled the last 2 bottles of water from the cooler and handed one to Mike.
Thanks, man,
Mike said while reaching for the bottle. No problem. We're going to need it, I said. Mike chuckled slightly and said goodnight and climbed into his tent. I was not extremely tired yet, so I rekindled the low-burning embers in the fire pit into a small fire. I sat by this fire listening to the crickets and the wind blowing through the trees. My mind soon flashed back to the story that Mike had told me, and I pondered on that for a while. I thought of the mystical energy surrounding these lands and felt a slight breeze come through the camp. I shuddered a bit due to the cool nature of the breeze. I then decided to stamp out the fire and turn in for the night. Sun bursting once again through the small gaps in my canvas tent. I awoke to the sound of conversation outside my tent. I once again dressed in full garb and exited my tent to greet the day. Mike and another fellow reenactor were talking near the fire. "Morning, gents," I said as I crouched and warmed my hands by the fire.
"Good morning,"
Mike and the other gentleman replied. "What's on the menu this morning, Mike?"
"I figured we'd go into the fair here and get a couple Scotch eggs,"
Mike replied. "Sounds good to me." The fellow reenactor, later come to be known as Charlie, bid his farewell as Mike and I started heading for the Scotch egg booth. Scotch eggs are delicious. What is not to like better than a hard-boiled egg wrapped in pork sausage and fried, slathered with fresh-made stone-ground mustard? Mike and I received our eggs and sat on a bench near the booth to enjoy the delectable morsels of food. Upon finishing our food, we once again heard the artillery cannon blast. Well, here we go. Mike and I slowly stood up and started walking around the outer perimeter of the park, preparing for the onslaught of visitors for the day. For the 2 days remaining at the fair, I was selected to be an actor in a ball of deer. Mike was an actor. We both had to immerse ourselves in the language and actions of someone in the 18th century. We walked up to one of the many taverns to fill our cups with beer. Mike and I walked around for a little while and split up after about half an hour. I set up my tip jar at one of the taverns, set up my lute guitar, and started playing songs of the period. The song Wild Rover was a particular favorite throughout the guests, and each tavern I set up at throughout the day somehow inevitably requested that song. It was around noon when Mike and I met up again atop the hill in the far back of the fair. Now, after several cups of beer, I thought it would be wise to switch to water. Remembering that Mike and I had drank the last of ours, I was going to have to go on a small search for water. Hey, Mike, I'm going to go see if I can find some water. I'll be back in a few. Would you mind watching my things?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll be here,
Mike replied. I started to walk a little ways down the hill and saw 2 reenactors drinking water from their cups. I approached and introduced myself. Good day, sirs. I was curious as to where you had found your water.
Good day. My name is Todd and this is James. You must be new around here. You'll have to walk up this trail. There's a fresh natural spring up there. If you'd like to follow us, we were just about to head back up and get more, one of them said in a rather genuine English accent. Spring? I thought the spring was capped off, I asked, sounding puzzled. Come, sir, 'tis right this way,
James said. The 2 men started their way up the old dirt trail. I followed. I noticed that the men were talking about events that happened in the late 18th century, as if they were talking about current events. Man, these guys are really dedicated to the bit, I remember thinking to myself. We walked for about 10 minutes or so when we came upon a small stone well at the top of a hill. I looked down the shallow well, and indeed there was a fresh stream of water trickling into the well.
Guys, I thought this was supposed to be capped off,
I said in a concerned tone.
Nay, this well is the source of all our water, crops and drinking alike. Just drop your cup into the well and drink plentifully.
I did as instructed and dipped my cup into the spring. I lifted the cup to my nose, smelling for any foul odor. The smell was of pure spring water. I did not see any sediment or anything in the cup, so I took a swig of it. The water was cool and had a distinct alkaline taste, pure and crisp.
Long travel, sir?
James asked. No, not really. Only about a 10-mile journey from home, I replied. The 2 men looked at each other and Todd scoffed.
10 miles? That's quite a ways.
Not really. Only takes about 10 minutes to get here. Todd and James once again looked at each other with a puzzled expression. I couldn't help but think that these guys must really need an escape from their home lives to be this dedicated. However, there are a lot of participants that like to stay in character no matter if it's a visitor or another reenactor. Suddenly, I became aware of a cool breeze flowing through the trails. Todd and James bid me good day and soon started walking back to the fair. After a minute or so, I was completely isolated, sitting at the spring. I noticed that I could no longer hear the bustling of the fair, and chalked it up to the dense woodland surrounding me. I sat drinking the cool spring water, soon finishing the cup and found myself dipping the cup in once more. All right, it's time to head back, I said to myself as I stood and prepared to walk back down the trail. I started walking down, and about 10 minutes in I realized that I could still not hear the fair. No music, no laughter, nothing. I kept walking and began to feel like something was wrong. I must have taken the wrong turn somewhere. I could have sworn this was the way, I thought to myself. Stopping and taking another sip of water from my cup, I felt that strange, cool breeze again. The hair on my arms and neck stood up on end. Something strange was going on here. I walked another 5 minutes or so and could start to hear faint voices in the distance. I picked up my pace. The trees started to thin out, and soon something came into view. It was a wooden wall made of logs. What the hell? I've never seen this before, I said to myself. My stomach started to turn as I had a feeling that something was absolutely wrong. I started to panic a little. I started jogging up and down the log wall and soon found an opening on the opposite side. I took my first look inside this place, and my heart dropped. This looked nothing like the fair. I took a few moments to take it all in, and something told me that this may indeed be a real settlement. There is no way this is happening. This cannot be real. Maybe I'm dehydrated and seeing things. I slowly started to walk into the settlement. There were many horses, either pulling wooden carts, wagons, or even pulling plows in the garden. The ground was muddy and slick. I heard shouts from children running and playing whilst weaving in and out of small one-room cabins throughout the village. I meandered down the main drag when my eyes locked onto the two gentlemen who had shown me the well. I quickly jogged up to them. Guys, seriously, what's going on? Why, what do you mean? James replied. Okay, seriously, will you drop the act for a minute? Where is the fair? I asked with a slightly irritable tone. They stared at me for a moment. Then Todd spoke.
Sir, are you feeling okay?
Maybe we should fetch the doctor, James stated. I don't need a goddamn doctor. I want to know what in the hell is going on. At this point, a small crowd of people were starting to gather. The crowd consisted of about 7 or 8 people. First, may I ask that you temper your language, sir? I fear that you may have a touch of the fever. Come with us and we shall escort you to the doctor. My blood began to boil and I felt my face turning red. I am completely done with you two. Please take me to someone who knows just what is going on around here, I seethed. As you wish, sir, James stated as himself and Todd started walking towards the rear of the village. I stayed quiet as we approached a small cabin in the northwest corner of the village. As we stepped up to the door, James knocked twice. Doctor, we have a man here who would wish to speak to you, James said through the door. One moment, I heard the doctor exclaim inside the cabin. I heard a lot of rustling about and items clanking together. Then with a swift click, the door swung open. Good evening, Doctor. Sorry to have bothered you at such a late notice, but we have stumbled across this dear fellow who doesn't seem quite to have his faculties about him. Well then, come on inside. James, Todd, and I stepped into the small cabin. There was a small fire in the hearth, a long desk, a couple of chairs, a bed, and a small dining table in the opposite corner. The desk had several iron instruments strewn across its surface. What seems to be the problem? Okay, I understand that you guys may be way more into this than I am, but please tell me what's going on. This is part of the fair that I have never seen in my life, and I've been attending this fair for 30-odd years. So please, just drop the act and tell me where I'm at. The doctor looked at me with concern. What do you mean, where you at? You're in the new land called Ohio, the doctor stated with a concerned tone. Yeah, I'm aware of that. Seriously, what part of the fair are you from? The doctor looked over to James and Todd and approached them. There were hushed whispers, and soon after, James and Todd left the cabin. Wait, where are they going? They have other business to attend to. Now, please, sir, may I ask your name? My name is Henry, but look, I just want to know what's going on. Well, Henry, this is a relatively new town. We are just now starting to plow for our crops, the doctor stated. I started to feel sick to my stomach because I was slowly realizing that I was not where I was supposed to be, or possibly even when. Okay, doctor. I must not be feeling that great. I even forgot what year it was. Maybe it's the heat.
'Tis the year of our Lord 1781.
1781. There is absolutely no way that this can be true. Feigning recollection and attempting to assimilate to their time period, I spoke.
Oh, yes, sorry, Doctor. It must have been my fevered mind. Well, Henry, allow me to prepare something for you that will help you settle, the doctor replied. He walked over to a small hutch and started pulling small glass containers out. He grabbed a mortar and pestle and began to add different ingredients into the mortar. The doctor then began to grind the ingredients together and proceeded to put them in a small copper cup. He then walked over to the fire and grabbed a steaming kettle from a swinging hearth hook. The doctor walked back over to the table where he poured hot water into the cup. Grabbing the cup, he walked back over to me. There you are, sir. Drink this. It'll help with the nerves.
What is in this?
Just a few herbs to help with fever. Helps with nerves as well.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. I took a sip of the hot concoction. I noticed a strong aroma of mint. There were a few rosemary leaves tossed in, and what I also believed were bits of clove. The mixture was strong, but not too horrible tasting.
Now, Mr. Henry, if I may, you seemed quite worked up the moment you arrived. May I ask where you were traveling from?
Thinking up a quick story, I explained.
Well, I'm from a smaller settlement about 10 miles southeast from here. I find that quite interesting. We have been building here since early February, and I do not recall seeing any other settlement before this place here. Must be fairly new.
Yes, sir, it is new. My family and I just completed our home, and I was traveling to find food and scout out the land, I said while taking another sip of the drink.
I see. And how is it that you've traveled here? I see no horse nor wagon in sight.
I walked, sir.
So, if I am understanding this correctly, you established a home with your family and came looking for food and scouting out land.
Yes, sir. Well, not exact, the doctor interrupted me.
With no rifle? No knives or supplies of any kind?
The doctor asked with a suspicious look on his face. I started to perspire slightly. I had to dig down and really come up with something to validate my story. Doctor, I actually prefer to trap small game with snares made of sapling wood. I find it the most effective way to ensure a fresh kill every time. I don't need much, maybe some water, and I can forage for berries along the way. I noticed that the doctor's facial expression relaxed a bit, not looking as suspicious.
I see. And for that you need nothing? Tell me, Mr. Henry, how would you go about dispatching your catch?
Usually, I pin it down if still alive and hit it with a large rock. Once dispatched, I carry it back home where my tools are for preparing my catch. The doctor stared at me for what seemed like 20 seconds or so.
Well, then I believe maybe it would be best for you to lie down and get some rest,
the doctor said as he slapped his thighs and stood. I don't know if that would be necessary, sir.
Judging by what James and Todd told me about your odd behavior in the streets, I believe it may be best for you and all around that you get some rest. You may use this bed over here. There's hot water for tea, and if you require anything else, just say so. I have to pay a visit to someone, and I shall return promptly,
the doctor said as he put on his jacket. The doctor opened his door and walked out without saying another word. I took this time to look around a bit in the small cabin. I rifled through a small desk that was sitting next to the hutch. I found several correspondence letters from a variety of other settlements, the most prominent one being from Jamestown requesting the doctor's return. I put the letters back where I found them and walked over to the bed. It was made up in the old style. rope bed construction with a mattress made of straw. I sat. I closed my eyes and rubbed my face. This cannot be real. I've got to be dreaming. Maybe if I do sleep a little, I'll wake up. Maybe I passed out or something on the way to the spring, I thought to myself. I laid down on the bed after placing my hat on the small end table. Soon I drifted off to sleep with my mind swirling with possibilities of what could have led me to this particular predicament. I awoke to the door being flung open by the doctor. Following the doctor were two men dressed in full Continental military regalia. The two military men walked over to me and started asking questions. "Sir, what is your name and where are you from?" one of the Continentals said. "Hasn't the doctor told you?" I replied. "Sir, we have scouted out 30 miles or so in every direction. There is not nor ever has been any sign of any other settlement." "I don't know what to tell you. That is where I am from," I said as I started to stand. The two men seemed to be slightly startled by my movement and shifted into defensive positions. "On behalf of the Continental Army, we are going to have to take you and escort you to another location," the man said. "Hold on. Wait a minute." As I started to speak, one of the men grabbed my right arm and started to pull me towards the door. "What is going on? I have a right to know!" I exclaimed. The man stopped and the other Continental grabbed a hold of my haversack bag and started searching it. "We have reason to believe that you may be a spy. We are holding you until proven otherwise." "A spy? What?" I said. I then realized that they said the year was 1781. The Revolutionary War hadn't ended until 1783. My blood ran cold as I realized that they were truly holding me as a prisoner. "What in the devil is this?" the man searching my bag exclaimed. The man held up my cell phone. Both men jumped a bit when the screen automatically flicked on. On the background of the phone was a picture of the smiling faces of my wife and daughter. I had noticed that in the top right corner where the signal bar should be, read SOS. The man dropped the phone the moment he saw the screen turn on. "What type of devil's game is this? Are you mad?" the man growled. The phone was lying there on the dirt floor, and soon the screen went back to black. "Take him away!" Suddenly I was thrust in front of the soldier and pushed out of the doorway and into the streets. The men stopped and tied my arms together with leather straps. Then they placed heavy iron cuffs on my wrists. We began walking towards the center of the village. One soldier in front of me leading the way, I dared not try and struggle because the other soldier behind me had his rifle pushed against my back. We walked into a smaller structure. The structure was dark. The only light permeated through the small cracks in the roof and walls. There was a wooden support pole in the middle of the structure. The Continental soldiers then unbound me, placing my back against the pole, and tied my arms together behind the pole. "Why are you doing this to me?" I asked. "You ought not be asking any questions at the moment. Lieutenant Colonel Stacy will be here in a couple of days. You may then plead your case," one of the men said. The two men swiftly walked out of the doorway and shut it. I heard what sounded like a wooden crossbeam slide down and bar the door from the outside. For several hours I heard nothing but faint yelling of children running around the village. Occasionally I heard footsteps shuffling towards the door of the structure. I had slid down the post and sat on the dirt and straw-covered floor. I began to sink into a deep state of sorrow as I continued to think about the gravity of the situation that I was in. Before much longer, I heard the wooden bar on the other side of the door lift up and away. The door opened. One of the soldiers who brought me here walked up to me. "I'm going to release your shackles momentarily. Any sign of a fight and the other soldier will fire at will." "Okay," I said, slightly nodding. The soldier released my shackles and leather bindings. I was spun around and he grabbed my arms and reshackled my wrists around the pole so that my arms were no longer behind me. The soldier then produced a small piece of bread and a small metal cup full of water. He placed the bread and cup on the floor at my feet. "Just to keep you alive," the soldier said. I said nothing. The soldier then turned and left the building. I heard the wooden bar slide back into place. I sat back down and reached for the bread and took a bite. It was extremely dry, so I lifted the small metal cup and took a sip. I noticed that the metal cup's handle was slightly loose and water was leaking out of one of the holes used to rivet the handle in place. I drank the water until it was below that hole in order to keep the remaining water inside. Evening was slowly approaching and the light emanating through the cracks of the structure started to fade into complete darkness. Before long, I saw another source of light coming through the small cracks in the doorway. Looked like fire the way it was flickering, possibly a torch. I began to feel tired and leaned my shoulder and head on the post and fell asleep shortly after. I awoke to a loud thump on the door.
"What are you doing? Stay clear, I say!"
Someone shouted from outside the door. My arms and shoulder were sore from leaning on that post for what must have been several hours. I was thirsty. I drank what was left in the cup. As I took the last sip, the top portion of the handle came loose. I suddenly came to the realization that I could potentially use this handle to pick the locks on my shackles. I wiggled the handle back and forth for a few minutes until it finally came loose from the cup. I quickly felt around for the lock on my shackles, and upon locating it, I attempted to stick the handle ends into the keyhole. Luckily, they were the old screw-top cuffs. I was able to latch on to something inside the locking mechanism and was able to eventually unlock the cuff to my left arm. I freed myself from the post, trying not to make much noise. I quickly unlocked the right cuff.
"Have you checked on the prisoner?"
I heard someone say outside of the door. No sooner than that being said, the wooden bar raised again. I quickly shoved the shackles back on my wrists and hid the broken handle under my leg. The door opened.
"You! Are you still alive?"
one of the soldiers said. I turned my head slightly to face him.
"Yeah, I am." "Good. We will check on you at first morning light. Guards will be in front of this door all night."
The soldier turned and closed the door. I did not hesitate to remove my shackles once again. I knew that I had to come up with a plan. There had to be several hours at least before dawn. I pondered my escape. I was tired, but I managed to keep myself awake and alert. I devised a plan that may possibly just work. I would wait until the first guard came to check on me in the morning, and unbeknownst to him, I will be standing just inside the door as it swings open. I'll attempt to knock him down and make a run for it. I sat for a few more hours and started seeing thin lines of purple light from the rising sun. My heart began to beat faster as I heard footsteps approach the door. I stood up and prepared to run for my life. The wooden bar was removed, and just as they were pulling the door open, I rammed the door. It took a considerable amount of force to knock through two of the guards that were standing on the other side. My natural strength combined with adrenaline allowed me to surprise them and knock them over. I began to run. Running as fast as I could, I located the village exit and headed that way.
"To arms! Find him!"
I heard one of the soldiers yell. I kept pushing. My feet were hitting the ground harder and faster than ever before. I rounded the village exit, almost running headfirst into two men who appeared to be coming back from a hunt. They had several rabbits hung over their shoulders. Quickly dodging them, I made a break for the woodlands. I kept running until I could no longer hear yelling behind me. My chest was pounding. It felt like 1,000 knives stabbing my lungs each time I drew a breath in. I stopped and turned around to look behind me. I saw nothing except trees and bushes. There was a large boulder just to the right of me, and I decided to hunker down behind it for a moment to catch my breath. I sat down behind the rock, resting my back on its cool surface. I waited there about 10 minutes or so, and then stood up. I still did not see anyone behind me. I decided to keep running, changing directions every 200 yards or so. I must have traveled for at least 4 to 5 miles. I slowed my pace to a fast walk, feeling confident that I had eluded the soldiers for the time being. I walked for several more miles until I arrived at a small creek. I started to follow the creek for another mile or so, and then froze in my tracks when I heard what sounded like a voice. I noticed a large fallen tree about 10 feet away or so. I began to get down on my hands and knees to crawl toward the tree for cover. Leaning against the tree, I started to hear footsteps swishing through the creek a little farther up ahead. I slowly raised my head above the tree's massive trunk to try and see what was happening. Peering ahead, probably 80 to 90 feet upstream, I saw what looked like a true-blooded Native American. I watched him for several seconds until a large walnut fell off a tree above me and made a loud splashing noise. I saw the native look in my direction, so I ducked down behind the tree again quickly. I heard him yell. Then suddenly it sounded as if he were running in my direction. I stood up and started running away from him. He kept yelling and I kept running until I heard this.
Wait, friend!
I slowed my running down to a walk and looked back. The native was holding his hands up in the air as though he was symbolizing that he was not a threat. I stopped and turned to face him. I allowed the native to walk closer to me, and as he came into focus, I noticed that he looked awfully familiar.
Wait, Mike? Is that you?
I exclaimed. The native had a confused look on his face.
No, name is Red Wolf.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You look almost identical to one of my friends,
I said while still trying to catch my breath. Red Wolf stuck out his right arm like he was going to shake my hand. I reached out and he grabbed the inner part of my forearm closer to my elbow. I matched his gesture. Red Wolf shook my arm as I shook his.
My name is Henry,
I stated.
Henry.
Strong name, Red Wolf replied.
I'm sorry if I'm interrupting anything. You see, I was being chased.
Chased? By a Continental? Red Wolf asked.
Yes. How did you know?
I asked in return.
I see many times strange people come. This area is powerful. Many people get lost. Don't know where to go. I find them. Always here,
Red Wolf explained.
Many people? So you've seen a lot of people come through here?
I asked.
Spirit of the trees and earth guide me. I come look and find others.
I'm sorry, but how do you know English so well?
We do trade with settlers. Crops for weapons, medicine.
Oh, I see.
So you know the village back that way?
I pointed in the direction that I had come from.
Yes, many trade there.
Suddenly, piercing the silence of the quiet woods were heavy footfalls and twigs and sticks breaking. Voices of the Continental soldiers rang out.
He can't be far. Find him. Bring him back.
I looked at Red Wolf with a look of panic.
Come, follow,
Red Wolf said. Red Wolf began darting through the trees and across the creek. I stayed right on his heels. We ran for what seemed like 20 minutes. Finally, we approached a small Native American village. There were huts made of branches and tree bark, teepees, and several thatch-roofed clay homes. As we entered the village, Red Wolf instructed me to go into one of the huts. I crawled inside first and Red Wolf after.
You stay. I go out to meet Continentals,
Red Wolf said.
Okay,
I replied. Approximately 15 minutes went by, and then I started to hear the yelling of the Continental soldiers entering the village. I heard murmured conversation. The conversing lasted for about 5 minutes, and then I heard what sounded like the soldiers heading back in the direction that they had come. Shortly after that, Red Wolf entered the hut.
Are they gone?
I asked.
Yes, I tell them no stranger here. We say never saw anyone. A long sigh of relief exited my lungs. Thank God. I thought I was about to get captured again. No, they trust us. We teach how to grow food. All right, then. So, may I ask you a question? Yes. So, back there in the woods, you were saying that many people come through here. What exactly did you mean by that? Other settlers? Red Wolf thought about his answer for a moment. No. People like you. Like me. What do you mean? People from a different land. I have seen many. I have helped many. Many lose their way. I grow to help. Strange power comes from the river. I thought about this answer for a moment or two. How do you know to help them? I see the look on their face. It's a look of fear and loss. Somehow I know I am meant to help. You see, all creatures are connected. The trees, the water, the wind, all share the same spirit. So did you know I was out there? What were you doing there so far from your village? I felt a shift in the winds and knew something was happening. I follow my inner guide, the wolf. Red Wolf grabbed the talisman that he wore around his neck. It was a carving of a wolf's head crafted from bone. He looked at it by the light of the small fire in the hut, as though he were lost in deep thought. So you knew I was out there? I did not know for sure. I just knew to keep walking. I was guided by the spirits. Then I saw you. When I saw you close, I felt you were connected in some way. I knew I had to help. I took a moment to take all this in. Red Wolf stoked the fire a bit, causing the flames to rise a little higher. The walls of the hut came into light, with various animal skins hung on them. Antlers and hooves lined the top of the walls. A small crude table was on the far opposite side of the hut. Atop the table were several knives, arrows, and spearheads. I looked back over to Red Wolf. So you said you have helped people in the past. How did you help them? I showed them their way. Some did fail. Some made it home. Are you able to help me get back home? Only if you listen to your heart. Accept the spirits of the land. They will lead you home if you listen, Red Wolf stated. How do I do that? Time for rest, friend. You'll sleep now. Red Wolf unrolled the deer pelt on the far side of the hut and instructed me to lay down. He handed me a hollowed-out gourd filled with water. Drink now. Sleep, Red Wolf said. I did as he instructed. I drank plentifully from the gourd, then set it down next to me. I laid down and let the exhaustion envelop me. I soon fell asleep while listening to the crackle of the fire. The morning soon arrived, and Red Wolf was shaking my shoulder. Time to rise. We must go. Go where? Remains to be seen. Red Wolf walked over and grabbed a few arrows in his longbow. He had slung a deerskin quiver upon his back and motioned towards the door of the hut. I slowly stood and stretched. That was probably the best sleep I've had in a while. And to that fact I was surprised due to the circumstance that I currently found myself in. I walked out of the hut into the bright morning sun. I looked up to see the green leaves from the long tree branches. It seemed as though the trees were surrounding us and protecting us from anything else. Come, this way, Red Wolf said. I followed him out into the dense woodland.
We walked for a while, and soon we found ourselves back at the very creek we had met. "I show you our way," Red Wolf said. He held his right index finger up to his mouth, signaling me to stay quiet. Then he put his hand lower towards the ground with the palm facing down, indicating that he wanted me to stay where I was. He then started creeping forward silently as he withdrew the bow from his back and an arrow from the quiver. Red Wolf kept walking forward slowly and lowered himself to a half-crouching position. I watched silently as he drew back the bow. I tried to see what he was aiming at. However, I could not see anything. With a sudden swish, the arrow was released from the bow at lightning speed. Red Wolf stood there for a moment and then signaled me to follow. We trampled through knee-high vegetation and around several trees. Red Wolf stopped about 10 feet in front of me and looked down. I walked up next to him to find an 8-point buck lying on the ground with an arrow dug deep into its chest cavity. I watched as Red Wolf bent down and closed the eyes of the animal. I believe he said some type of prayer in his native language, then stood and looked at me. "We thank spirits of the earth and release spirit of the deer, thanking for its sacrifice to keep us nourished. Begin as part of the earth, end as part of the earth." This was a humbling moment. The love and care that these natives have for the earth and all the creatures upon it. Red Wolf pulled his arrow from the deer. He had shot and killed a deer from at least 50 yards away with one swift, deadly shot. I was amazed at his accuracy. He then began making incisions with the arrow across the belly of the deer. He skillfully cleaned the deer and then tied a rope to all 4 legs, bringing them together. I watched as he angled himself in such a way to hoist the deer upon his shoulders. I followed him back to his village in silence. Arriving at the village, he met up with some of the other natives that helped butcher the deer, and they soon had meat hung on sticks over the fire. Red Wolf introduced me to several other tribe mates. I stood and listened to their stories of experiences they have with other settlers, some good and some not so great. Tales of some skirmishes with other settlements that forced them to move to where they are now. Red Wolf took me back out to a different part of the woodlands and showed me how to use his longbow. I shot off a few arrows and soon felt that I had a decent handle on using the bow. "Now focus. Deep breath. Breathe. Release." I took a deep breath and fired my final arrow. The arrow struck a tree and fell instantly to the ground. Upon inspection, the tip of the arrow had shattered. There was a distinct pattern of red flint that was striped through the arrow. "Arrow broke. Not good for hunting. Come, we must get back." Red Wolf and I started walking back to the village. The day was slowly fading to dusk when we arrived back. The tribe were dancing around the fire, beating drums and singing their ancestral songs. "What are they singing about?" "Giving thanks for food. Thanking the spirits that connect us all." "Oh, I see." Red Wolf and I approached the ceremony. He joined in the ceremony as I took a place sitting on a nearby log. I sat and watched as they danced and played music around the fire. The dance continued for about 20 minutes. I was entranced at the sight. They all seemed so spiritual and intentional in their actions, their steps, their every movement. Soon after the music ended, the tribe started harvesting the meat off the fire and handing it to each other. Red Wolf grabbed 2 softball-sized pieces of meat and started walking my way. "Eat, for nourishment," Red Wolf said as he sat down on the log next to me. Without hesitation, I grabbed the venison and took a large bite. The meat was juicy and flavorful. The juice ran down my chin as I continued to devour the food. Juices covering my hands and lap as I shoved the last bite into my mouth. After I finished chewing, I looked over at Red Wolf. He was halfway done with his food. He noticed me staring at him. Only a fool eats fast on an empty stomach.
I laughed.
Oh, yeah? You should see some of the heavily processed foods that
I stopped speaking because I realized that he would have no idea as to what I was talking about. Red Wolf just smiled and resumed eating his food. I noticed that after most of the tribe was done eating, they gathered around the fire. There were people talking about their day and how good the food was. Once Red Wolf had finished, he rinsed his hands with a tiny bit of water from his gourd canteen. He then took a sip of the water and offered the canteen to me. I took the canteen and took a long swallow of cool water.
"Thank you,"
I said. Red Wolf nodded. "When do you think you will be going back to the village that was chasing me?"
"I do not know."
"Well, I was just asking because they still have my bag. I have personal belongings in that bag that are important to me, so I'd like to retrieve them."
"We go now,"
Red Wolf said.
"Now?
Like, right now? It's dark. Won't we get lost?" Red Wolf just smiled and chuckled as he rose to his feet.
"Come, we go."
I stood up and started to follow him out of his village. As we walked by the rest of the tribe, one older man stepped in my path.
"Yankuna, Usun, Pasana Pataki,"
the old man said as he waved a stick in front of me. He then pushed his finger into a red substance and brushed it over my right eye.
"For a safe passage. Village healer,"
Red Wolf said. I looked at the old man and nodded a sign of appreciation. The man nodded back and stepped out of my way.
"We go now,"
Red Wolf said. I followed Red Wolf out into the dark woodland. We walked for about an hour, and I noticed that the moon was especially bright out. The moon and stars were brighter than I'd ever seen. This made it a lot easier to see where we were going. We met up with the creek and followed for what seemed like miles. Red Wolf then took a hard right back into the dense woodland. We kept traveling in that direction for quite some time until I started seeing a faint light in the distance through the trees. Red Wolf stopped.
"Settlers,"
he said in a hushed tone.
"What do we do now?" "Stay quiet. Follow."
Red Wolf started creeping towards the settlement as I followed in his very footsteps. Soon we reached that old familiar log wall that I had seen when first stumbling upon the settlement. Red Wolf stayed close to the wall as we crept around to the back of the settlement. We continued about 20 feet or so and stopped.
"We go here,"
Red Wolf said as he pointed to a small opening in between one of the logs. The opening was just big enough for a man to squeeze through.
"I go first. Then I tell you when you go,"
he said quietly.
"Okay,"
I whispered. Red Wolf stuck his head into the opening and looked around, then squeezed his body through and disappeared from view. I quickly shuffled up to the opening and saw Red Wolf with his back leaning against one of the cabins. He took another look around and then looked back at me. He signaled for me to enter. I squeezed through the opening and met him alongside the cabin. We crept to the corner of the cabin and Red Wolf stopped to peer around the corner. He quickly pulled his head back and flattened his back against the cabin. I followed suit. I started to hear voices and footsteps. The door to the cabin opened and someone walked inside. We heard the door close. Red Wolf looked around the corner a second time. He signaled me to follow him. We rushed across the alleyway that was half lit by a torch on the outside of one of the cabins. We ducked into a small, dark, 3-foot wide space that was in between a cabin and the settlement wall. Red Wolf and I began crawling quietly to the other end of the cabin. Red Wolf looked around the corner of this cabin, finding the coast was clear. We slinked down to the other side of the cabin and noticed a small window on this side. Red Wolf peered inside.
"We here,"
he whispered. I stood up to look into the window. Sure enough, it was the doctor's cabin.
I did not see anyone inside. I looked around the cabin interior and spied my haversack bag on the doctor's desk.
Yeah, there it is. How do we get inside?
Red Wolf started to push softly on the window, and it started to open from the side on a swivel. I looked at Red Wolf, and he had his hands clasped together, palms up, and nodded at me. I put my foot in his hands, and he hoisted me up through the window. I carefully navigated myself through the window and over the bed that was just below me. Once fully inside, I walked over to my haversack bag. Upon inspection, everything seemed to be there except for my phone. I began looking everywhere in the cabin and finally came to the desk drawer. Upon opening the drawer, there sat my phone. I grabbed the phone and tossed it into my haversack and quickly jaunted back to the window, picking up my tricorn hat along the way. As I was lowering myself down outside the window, I heard the door open to the doctor's cabin. Laughter was heard as he bid another person good night. I finished lowering myself and then stood and peeked through the window. The doctor was stumbling around his cabin, clearly intoxicated. He looked in my direction, and I ducked down and laid in the dark shadows. Red Wolf and I held our breath for several moments. Suddenly we heard the window moving.
I don't recall having opened this,
the doctor said with slurred speech. The doctor then began chuckling to himself as we heard the window close in a loud against the cabin wall. Red Wolf and I waited there for a good 5 minutes or so, and finally heard snoring coming from within the cabin. I stood back up and peered back into the cabin one last time. The doctor had fallen into his bed and passed out due to his drunken state. Red Wolf signaled for me to follow him back to the opening in the wall. We crept back the same way we came, avoiding as much light as we could and making little noise. We both managed to squeeze back through the opening and free ourselves from the settlement. Red Wolf and I started making our way back through the woodland on the very same trail that had led me here. We walked the uphill trail for about 10 minutes and came upon a familiar sight, the old spring. The dawn had started breaking, and golden rays of light mixed with reds, pinks, and blues spread throughout the treetops.
You go home, Red Wolf said.
How? How do I get back? Red Wolf pointed at the spring.
Drink.
I pulled out the old tin cup from my haversack and bent over to fill the cup. I stopped before it touched the water and stood back up.
Why wait?
Red Wolf asked with a confused look on his face.
I'm not really sure. I just feel like maybe I'll never see you again. We are all connected. You will see me in the next life,
Red Wolf replied. I walked over to him and extended my right arm just as he did when we first met. Red Wolf looked and grabbed my forearm in a fierce grip. He smiled, and with his other hand he patted my right shoulder.
I'll see you again, friend.
He then motioned toward the spring and turned. Red Wolf started walking back through the dense woodland. I stood and watched him disappear into the trees. Smiling, I bent over and filled my cup. I raised the cup as kind of a cheers to Red Wolf. I closed my eyes and took a long drink. I thought about how everything is connected, how the rivers, trees, and earth all have a spirit. I thought about how we should all remember this and have the same respect for everything as they did. Moments later, I felt the cool breeze rush up onto me through the trees. I opened my eyes. I noticed the sun was a little higher in the sky than before. Appeared to be around noon. I started hearing faint music from guitars and bagpipes. The distinct aromas of food and campfire. I poured the rest of the water out of my cup back into the spring. Walking back down the pathway, the music became louder and the scents more prominent. A couple of minutes later, I found myself walking into a large opening with many canvas tents. People walking around with modern clothing and taking pictures.
I'm back,
I whispered to myself. I was curious, though, of the fact that I had just spent several days in the past. So how did I end up right back here? I remember sweeping the thought away because it didn't matter. I was home. The instant relief of being home again swept over me like a heated blanket on a cold night. I looked to my left toward the tavern at the top of the hill and noticed my friend Mike still sitting there where I had left him. I started walking towards him and stopped dead in my tracks as I saw two men dressed in Continental uniforms walk by with rifles on their shoulders. The two men kept walking and looked at me, nodded their heads, and kept walking away. It took me a second to realize that I was holding my breath. I released my breath and continued walking up the hill.
"Hey, man, your stuff is all safe and sound,"
Mike said. I looked down at my lute guitar and stared for a moment.
"You okay, man?"
Mike asked me, snapping me out of my trance. "Yeah, man, I'm good. I think that Scotch egg must have messed with me. I think I'm going to gather my things and head back to the tent for a while. Also, sorry that I was gone so long."
"It's no problem. You weren't gone but about 10 minutes. But you go take care of yourself. You sure you're okay?"
"Yeah, I'm good. I just think I need to lie down for a while." I collected my items and started heading back to camp. I felt even more relief when I saw all of my creature comforts still waiting for me in my tent. I opened one of the coolers and saw an ice-cold beer. I grabbed the beer and popped it open. The fizz and smell of the beer was heavenly to me. "Man, I needed this," I said to myself. Taking the first few sips of beer, I set it on an old wooden chest next to my bedroll. I decided to lay down and sleep for a while. I laid on my back and placed my tricorn hat over my face. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up because Mike was calling my name from outside the tent.
"Hey, Henry, you good?"
"Yeah, much better. I needed that." I stood up and stretched. Unfastening the flaps of my tent, I saw Mike stoking the fire. The twilight of dusk was once again descending on the park. Grabbing my unfinished beer, I walked out of the tent and over to a stump that I had used for a chair and sat down.
"You missed out on most of the fun today, man."
I chuckled. "I had plenty of fun. Trust me."
"Okay. Sleeping?"
Mike said, puzzled. Once again, I just chuckled. Mike shook his head and went back to stoking the fire. I sat and listened since the music had faded and heard the wind rustle in the treetops. I thought of Red Wolf and how he had taught me so much. Mike had thrown a couple beer brats on the gridirons over the fire. It reminded me of the venison and how good it was. "Hey, Mike," I said.
"Yeah?"
"I think maybe in the morning I may pack up my things. I think I've had enough of this weekend. I kind of miss my family."
"What? It's only been 2 days. Only 1 day left. We look forward to this every year."
"Listen, man, I'm not saying that you have to leave. I can always come back Monday and pick you up."
"Well, okay then, if that's what you want to do. I'm not going to miss the rest of the fair, though."
"I understand." We sat by the fire, watched the brats as they sizzled. We ate the brats once they were done cooking, and shortly after, we turned in for the night. I slept like a rock. The morning came within minutes, it seemed. I woke myself up with a cup of coffee that Mike had percolated in a pot over the fire.
"You sure you want to leave?"
Mike asked. "Yeah, I'm sure."
"All right, man. Well, I'm going to head back out to the fair. I'll see you Monday."
"See you Monday, man." I started packing my things into various containers and deconstructed my tent. It took me about an hour and a half to trek everything out to the car, several trips just on my own. I sat behind the wheel of my car and laughed. If I only had this car with me, I wonder what Red Wolf would have thought then, I said, chuckling to myself. I shifted the car into drive and started my journey home. 15 minutes later, I was pulling into my driveway. I shifted the car into park and climbed out. My wife met me halfway up the sidewalk.
What are you doing home? I thought you weren't supposed to be back until Monday.
My wife asked. I guess I just missed my family. I gave her a kiss and walked into the house where my daughter greeted me. I reached down and picked her up and squeezed her in a tight hug. Moments later, my wife came back inside.
Since you're home, you mind if I run out and get a case of water? You took most of ours,
my wife said. Yeah, that's fine.
What's so funny?
Nothing, babe. Just glad to be home.
Well, I'll be back in a few.
I walked over to the refrigerator and opened it. One last bottle of water. I grabbed the water and twisted the cap off. I guess I should be more careful where I get my water, I said. I closed my eyes and took a drink.
Chilling tales for dark nights.